We know Titanic from so many stories, even a movie, but now we have its first full-sized digital scan. And nope, it's not like those models from before, where we mostly imagined what the ship was supposed to be like. This time we got a real digital scan. A team of experts really mapped the deep-sea floor around the Titanic together with the ship itself. We basically got a 3D view of the entire wreck, which is like going deep down beneath the ocean's surface and seeing Titanic as if all the water has been drained away. So, the story of the wreck started in 1985, 73 years after the Titanic went down. The explorer named Robert Ballard stumbled upon it somewhere between two submarines that also went down in that area. He was actually on a different task back then, so he didn't even have time to explore the ship properly. But as he was searching for the submarines, he realized how ocean currents affect sinking debris. He noticed the heaviest object sank quickly and left a trail of debris behind, the trail that followed the currents. Using this knowledge, Ballard made a hypothesis the Titanic had broken in two and left a debris trail as it sank. Before he found the wreck, everyone thought the ship just went down in one piece after hitting an iceberg. So everyone knew where the ship was so the adventure could start, or not. It was hard to explore it. The ship is enormous, and the dark depths of the ocean make it really difficult to capture its whole body in one go. So we mostly relied on glimpses of the decaying ship, and had to settle with teasing scattered parts of the whole picture and filling it up with speculations and stories. But in the summer of 2022, we finally got something different. A team of experts from Magellan Loaded, a company specializing in mapping the deep sea, teamed up with Atlantic Productions, who were making a documentary about the project. They embarked on a mission to capture the complete view of the Titanic. They used submersibles. Those are vehicles that go underwater, remotely controlled by a team of skilled explorers. These submersibles dove deep into the ocean. It wasn't an easy job. They spent over 200 hours collecting information about the entire length and breadth of the wreck. It was like a real-life treasure hunt. But instead of finding gold and jewels, they took something even more precious. Over 700,000 images of the Titanic from every angle possible. Yup, they took photos of every tiny part of the ship, even the not-so-interesting bits most of us would usually skip. Even mapping the muddy parts was an important part, because it helped fill in the gaps between the more exciting things they discovered. And this was a way for all of us to finally get a detailed 3D reconstruction. Even though it's been more than 100 years, you can still recognize the bow of the Titanic, covered in rust that hangs down like stalactites. On top of the bow is the boat deck, where a big hole gives us a glimpse into the empty space where the grand staircase once stood, like a window into the ship's glamorous past. Its stern is now a wild mess of twisted metal. As the Titanic went down, this part collapsed and spiraled into the seabed. The bow and the stern ended up separated by about 2,600 feet. There's a vast field of debris surrounding this giant, stuck on the seafloor. This debris is like a scattered treasure trove, full of intricate metalwork from the ship, statues, and even unopened champagne bottles. There are also personal belongings that went down together with the ship, like dozens of shoes resting across the seafloor. It was a tough task to do, go down and take all those pictures. It may not sound that hard at first, considering it was the vehicle that really immersed itself into such deep parts of the ocean, not the people. But studying the ocean is hard. We haven't explored, mapped, or even seen over 80% of it. The conditions are harsh, and the pressure becomes more intense the deeper you go. And their vehicle had to dive down to nearly 13,120 feet below the surface. That's like 12 Eiffel Towers stacked on top of each other. Plus, you have strong currents in that area, so it was probably like trying to navigate through a watery maze. And submersibles weren't supposed to touch anything. Even the slightest wrong step can damage the wreck that was already so fragile. It seems like the Titanic is frozen in time, so it will always be there waiting for us. But in reality, it's slowly disappearing. It's pretty obvious that the ocean water ruined it considering how long it has been down there. But it's not just that. The wreck itself has become a home for a specific type of Bacteria Halomonas titanicae that even got named after the famous ship. These bacteria have a special ability. They can survive inside rusty formations known as rusticles. They kind of look like icicles, those spikes of ice that form when water falls from something and freezes. These bacteria have a taste for iron, which is abundant in the ship's hull. For them, it's like a real buffet down there. And as time goes by, these bacteria will keep eating away at the iron in the ship, bit by bit, until one day, the feast comes to an end and the whole ship is gone. It's like a slow but steady recycling process. So this 3D model we got because of the hardworking team and technology comes at the best time because we never know how much time we have left with exploring the famous wreck. This time we might even understand the collision with the iceberg better. You know how movies always show the Titanic hitting the iceberg on its right side? Well, we can't even be certain about that. The scans could help us figure out if the ship actually grounded on the iceberg, like getting stuck on it. We can study the stern and analyze how the Titanic struck the seafloor. That will also help us understand what really happened during the sinking. Maybe we'll get a chance to discover if there was really a strong fire that sealed the fate of the Titanic. One theory says that the coal fire had been raging for a whole 3 weeks before the ship even took its first and last trip. And this could have made its hull weaker, which means most of the work was done. The iceberg just delivered the final blow, if there even was an iceberg, as some people wonder. There's an alternative theory they suggested where the Titanic may have actually hit a hidden mass of pack ice instead of a typical iceberg. Pack ice is made up of large sheets of ice that float near the ocean's surface and can be difficult to spot. They believe this pack ice might have drifted into the Atlantic from the Arctic Ocean. According to one professional mariner, Captain L.M. Collins, that stands up with that idea. If the Titanic had struck a regular iceberg, the ship would have sunk much more quickly than it did. And since the Titanic managed to stay on the surface for a relatively long period of time, less than 3 hours, maybe this was a different type of collision. The mariner also said there are differences in what people said they saw when the Titanic sank. He thinks these differences might be because of optical illusions. In this case, when people were looking at the ocean that night, the way the light was reflecting and the conditions at sea might have made things appear closer or distorted. So when they saw something in the water, it might not have been exactly what they thought it was. Whether it was an iceberg or something else. Binoculars might have helped the crew members to spot the potential danger, but unfortunately, they didn't have any. It appears they were locked inside a cabinet, and no one knew where the key was.
Have you ever wondered how much of the Titanic is left these days? Now, if you haven't been living under a rock, you probably know that it's been over 100 years since the world's most famous ship turned into a wreck. The RMS Titanic, the world's largest sea liner from the beginning of the 1900s, sank during its maiden voyage, just a few days after leaving port. The ship struck an iceberg on April 14, 1912, taking down over 1,500 passengers of more than 2,200 who were on board the liner at that time. As shocking as this may sound, the Titanic took over 3 years to be built and only 3 hours to sink. And if it were today, the ship would have cost over $210 million to be made. It was last seen on the surface of the Atlantic at 2:20 a.m., and for many decades, that was the last time people saw it. It wasn't until 1985 that the whereabouts of the ship were discovered by oceanographer Robert Ballard, and some parts of the Titanic became visible once again. One of the first discoveries made by Ballard's expedition was that the ship was indeed torn in half before sinking. The early exploratory missions to the part of the ocean floor where the Titanic now lies could only see the hull and the deck of the ship. According to Ballard, the main purpose of these missions was to understand how to preserve the ruins from deteriorating. Another goal was to recover the huge number of personal items scattered along the seabed. The explorer later said the view down there was as shocking as it was emotional. In the field of debris around the wreck, the oceanographer discovered plenty of small objects and personal belongings, many of which he brought back to the surface. There were shoes, some fancier than others. There were pieces of clothing that belonged to crew members, and there were huge propellers. If on the surface they gleamed and shined, on the ocean floor they were embedded and devoured by sand. Ballard pointed out that the area where kitchenware was scattered measured more than a mile in length. There were enough plates, pots, and pans to fill up an entire industrial kitchen. For the first time ever, 3D animation footage reveals exciting images. The simulations show the Titanic's evolution from when she first set sail in 1912 until the state of her ruins today. But simulations weren't enough for deep-sea explorer James Cameron, who who envisioned traveling to the heart of the wreck for the first time ever in the history of the ship. Yep, the same James Cameron who happens to be the director of a very famous movie about the ship. He has now dived 33 times to visit the wreck of the Titanic. Here's some fun trivia for you. The director says that his true passion has always been the ocean, and that ever since he was a kid, he wanted to study the sea. Directing, let's say, just happened to be his day job. And when the possibility of directing Titanic appeared, he said yes, just so that he could go and check out the ruins of the ship in real life. Now back to the wreck. According to James Cameron, it wasn't enough for researchers to access only the exterior of the ship. They needed to go inside, analyze and photograph what was left of the pompous interiors of the world's once biggest sea liner. Cameron piloted an innovative robot vehicle equipped with cameras. It helped the man to reveal spaces in the Titanic that no one had ever seen before since the ship touched the bottom. Turkish baths, for instance, still had their tiled walls standing up almost in all their entirety. These baths were exclusively for first-class passengers. They were located right next to the swimming bath and the third-class dining room, and were designed in the Moorish style. People resting there could get heating blankets and ask waiters to bring them anything they needed. If the pictures from before the disaster were astonishing, they carry a different kind of wow factor now, when everything you see in them is hidden underneath the surface of the water. Another shocking discovery was the ship's mast. If we look at the Titanic in its pre-sinking glory, the mast calls much of one's attention. Located on the bow of the huge ship, the mast held together the transmission cables for the Marconi system, a system of wireless telegraphy. That's also where the British merchant flag the Titanic flew was located. The mast stood at the height of a bit more than 100 feet and was equipped with a crow's nest. Nowadays, the mast is unrecognizable. Attacked by corrosion, it collapsed. The crow's nest broke apart too. Now we can see why the modern-day Titanic is a real treasure for deep-sea explorers. But as the wreck of the ship lies at an approximate depth of 12,500 feet, sunlight is non-existent there. So, piloted missions depend on high-end technological equipment to survey the area. Why do you think the Titanic went missing from the public eye for over 70 years? Well, because at that time, technology wasn't advanced enough for people to go down there, as well as bring back good footage of the wreck. Filmmakers were the ones who drove this technology to its advance by trying to film underwater. They began by building boxes to put their cameras inside. And now, deep-sea photography is highly advanced and allows us to marvel at the awesomeness of underwater life. Of course, taking pictures under the sea is no easy feat. For one thing, to withstand that crazy underwater pressure, submarines need to be really strong and have thick walls, no thinner than 11 inches. Plus, explorers need to understand how to film and photograph when there's almost no light around. There was another thing that made documenting the Titanic even more difficult. When the wreck of the ship was rediscovered by scientists, it was covered with red-colored rusty bacteria that made it even harder to take good pictures. As it happens, the color red does not reflect well underwater, which is unfortunate for photographers. For this reason, human-operated vehicles that go down to tour the ruins are equipped with powerful lighting devices. When you see some parts of the ship from afar, they look as if reddish-brown wax has been dripping all over the Titanic's ruins. But in reality, these icicle-shaped structures are colonies of microorganisms. When the ship sank, it brought down with it an enormous amount of bacteria that hadn't existed at the bottom of the ocean before. But now, these bacteria, together with the extreme conditions at the bottom of the ocean, have turned into a disastrous combination for the ruins of the ship. These red colonies of microorganisms actually feed off of iron and steel, which is basically all that is left of the Titanic. One kind of those microorganisms are bacteria called Halomonas titanicae. They can eat up to 220 pounds of iron per day. This makes the Titanic a colossal food source for them. There have been lots of speculations regarding the life expectancy of the ship's wreck after researchers discovered this bizarre rust. But according to Cameron and his research team, the Titanic isn't going to disintegrate anytime soon. In one of the latest expeditions down to the wreck, a piloted vehicle was funded to identify specifically one stateroom. It belonged to a very important passenger, Sir Benjamin Guggenheim. Yes, just like the museum. Guggenheim was the son of a mining magnate and a member of the elite group that boarded the transatlantic journey of the Titanic. Born in Philadelphia, Guggenheim was traveling back home to the US. But, as we all know, he never made it to his final destination. For the price that ranged from £400 to £800 back in 1912, the equivalent of £84,000 nowadays, one could book accommodation that was called a stateroom. Staterooms on the Titanic were the most luxurious kind of first-class rooms. They were located on the B or C decks and were decorated in more than 11 different styles, ranging from Jacobean, Georgian, Italian Renaissance, and the list goes on. These rooms were filled with carved paneling and marquetry made from exotic and rare kinds of wood, such as mahogany, oak, and so on. Guggenheim occupied one of these luxurious rooms, and 100 years later, one of his descendants funded an entire mission just to locate the precise stateroom the man stayed in. This expedition turned into a documentary for National Geographic, and they did manage to identify which stateroom was Guggenheim's, so kudos for them.
In the Titanic movie, you won't see any fumes above the fourth funnel of the legendary ocean liner, and it's not a mistake. Back in 1911, the year before the Dream ship's departure, large ships would mostly sail with 4 chimneys. They needed those to draw heat and fumes from their massive boilers. The Titanic was a real engineering gem that only needed 3 chimneys to function. So the fourth was added for balance and more impressive looks. The White Star Line thought the public would have been disappointed to see only 3 pipes on the greatest ship of all time. The Titanic's sister ships, the Olympic and the Britannic, also had 1 fake funnel each for the same reason. The dummy chimney wasn't completely useless and served for ventilation. It took out the fumes from the machine spaces in the lower decks and from one of the first-class general rooms. 1 big ventilation funnel, instead of several small ones, helped to declutter the upper decks and left more open space for passengers to enjoy their strolls. When Titanic went down, the funnels, each weighing 60 tons, went down with the rest of the ship. They were made extra tall to make sure the passengers weren't covered in the soot being ejected. Their height and weight let them stay in the upright position. The forward funnel, followed by the others, fell only when the ship went for the final dive. Those chimneys were much lighter than the bow, so they spread among other debris. The light material they were made of flattened once it hit the bottom, and the iron-eating bacteria living deep down took care of it later. The bow of Titanic remained intact when it hit the seabed, but the stern was completely mangled. When the famous ocean liner hit that iceberg, things got really messy. It took the future movie star a whole 2 hours and 40 minutes to submerge completely. The collision let water flood 6 out of 16 watertight compartments. As the water gushed into the starboard side, the ship started to tilt down in the front and a bit to the right. By midnight, the damaged compartments were spilling water into others, and it was chaos because these compartments were only watertight horizontally. Soon enough, water started flooding through the anchor chain holes, and by 2 a.m., the bow was sinking, and the stern's propellers were lifted out of the water. The ship kept flooding until the moment the bow went underwater, and the stern shot up almost 45 degrees. The weight of those massive propellers stressed the ship's midsection. The steel just couldn't handle it and failed. Survivors described that moment as some loud noise, like breaking china or falling gear. That was the Titanic's upper structure giving in. By 12 past 2 a.m., the bow and stern were only connected by the inner bottom structure. Minutes later, the bow, weighing almost 16,000 tons, broke loose from the stern. The stern rose sharply to an almost vertical position and started sinking slowly. By 2:20, it disappeared underwater. The bow was cruising down at about 13 miles per hour and had hit the ocean floor almost a half an hour before the stern. The 2 parts of the Titanic now lie 2,000 feet apart, pointing in different directions. The bow remained mostly intact, just covered in mud. The stern turned into a tangled wreck because of the implosions it went through during the descent. The air trapped within the structure just couldn't handle the increasing pressure of the water deep down. Signal rockets played a big part in the Titanic's tragedy. When a ship goes down, you're supposed to shoot up red flares to signal trouble. But someone decided to stock Titanic with white lights instead of the usual red ones. So when the ship smacked into that iceberg, The crew fired off white flares. The SS Californian was passing nearby, and his captain knew the Titanic was in a dangerous iceberg zone. The crew didn't spot the sinking Titanic, but they sure saw those white rockets. The radio between the ships was useless because the Californian's operator switched it off. The captain had a gut feeling something was off, so he flashed a Morse code light signal at Titanic. But he received no reply because the Titanic had already gone underwater. There was another ship, Samson, sailing alongside the Titanic. It had plenty of illegally hunted frozen seal meat from Canadian waters abroad, so it was sailing with lights off to remain unnoticed. When they saw the Titanic's white rockets, they thought it was the Coast Guard and zoomed away. Samson didn't have a radio, so they couldn't find out about the ongoing disaster. The crew got the news about Titanic only when they got to the coast of Iceland the following month. There have been many theories to explain the Titanic tragedy, and one of the recent ones says that there was a fire involved. An Irish journalist went full detective for decades, digging into the mystery, and stumbled upon a game-changer. He came across a photo album that had been hiding from the public for a century after the tragedy. In the pictures, taken at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Northern Ireland, just over a week before the liner sailed, you can clearly see a massive 30-foot black spot on the ship's hull. Maloney researched the photos and eyewitness testimony from the time and claimed that a fire spontaneously broke out inside of one of Titanic's enormous coal bunkers. It was raging for a whole 3 weeks and messed with the metal, critically weakening a crucial segment of the ship's hull. Back then, most ships had just one hull, so it was the only skin the Titanic had. That's why the iceberg managed to punch a hole through the ship so easily. If it hadn't been for the fire, the Titanic might have shrugged off that iceberg collision. The company operating the liner knew about the fire, but they decided to conceal that fact. They didn't want any negative stories in the press as they faced some serious competition in transatlantic voyages. The Titanic was sold out, so they stocked up on coal and made it sail. The moon might have also played a role in the sinking. Our satellite heavily affects tides on the Earth. The closer it is to our planet, the stronger the tides are because of the increasing gravity of the moon. Back in 1912, the moon was so close it made several glaciers in Greenland break apart. Massive chunks of ice that broke off from the glaciers started floating south. The supermoon event came just 6 minutes after a spring tide. During new and full moons, the alignment of the moon, the Earth, and the sun makes their combined gravity reach its peak. And the day before, our planet had come the closest to the sun that year, which made the gravity even stronger. This mixture of events created perfect conditions for one of the most powerful tides in history. It created the perfect conditions for the icebergs breaking off from Greenland's glaciers to move freely. Opponents of this theory say that the difference in tidal force wasn't actually that big, and it couldn't have been the main cause of the sinking. The iceberg tore down the side of the ship, leaving a huge opening in the hull. It wasn't a continuous rip, and damage was caused in several places. Some experts believe the ship would have survived the iceberg if it had hit head-on. The Titanic had watertight compartments designed to prevent flooding in case of a collision. Only the first 3 or 4 of these compartments would have been flooded. This could have helped save a lot of lives. Supporters of this theory put the blame for the disaster on First Officer William Murdoch. Huge, fast-moving ships don't just turn in a matter of seconds like a speeding car. It takes minutes. When Murdoch realized the collision was inevitable, he tried dodging left to avoid a direct hit. But despite his efforts, the ship still collided with the iceberg. You know the rest.
John watched on in disbelief as he drifted away on a piece of wood. In the freezing waters of the Arctic, slowly drifting away. John looked upon the vessel he had worked and lived on as it raised its enormous bow high into the sky, then broke in half, causing a sound that only a crack of lightning could replicate. Distraught and dumbstruck, believing that he, and he alone, knew the dark truth behind the demise of the unsinkable ship, the Titanic. 5 days earlier, as the Titanic set sail on its maiden voyage, John worked hard alongside his mates in the coal bunker, stocking up the coal to feed the Titanic's mighty furnace. They had stocked and stored more than John had ever witnessed on any other ship he'd worked on. But this was the Titanic, the grandest ship to have ever sailed the seas. On the Titanic, there could never be too much coal. As they left Belfast and pushed toward Southampton, there was a large bang below decks that went unnoticed. The furnace was roaring and the turbines were spinning, pushing the Titanic forward at a quickened pace. The crew cheered as the vessel moved forward, unaware of the loud, concerning noise. Arriving in Southampton, Greg came aboard, amongst hundreds of other passengers. With 13 years at sea, his vast experience included the role as a quartermaster on 6 previous ships. Ready for a new challenge aboard the greatest vessel ever made, he was looking forward to this next challenge of his career. Greg came with a wealth of experience, especially with sailing through the Arctic. His role was vital within the crew, understanding the seas around the North Pole. He would be a key lookout as they set to cross the perilous path of the Iceberg Alley. Greg had some concerns regarding the voyage. The Earth's orbit was remarkably close to the Sun and the Moon, causing higher tides. This would make icebergs more prominent, drifting them further away and towards the route of the Titanic as they journeyed to New York. Assessing the lookout tower and inspecting the available gear, Greg found no binoculars. This made him concerned, but the sailors just laughed at Greg. "If the deck is short on ice cubes, we'll be sure to plow right through a berg to resupply." A sailor laughed. Greg didn't share this sentiment. Eager to find out why they had been left short-handed on equipment, since he had such a vital role on the ship, Greg inquired further. Sadly, the officer with the keys to the binocular supply cupboard had been removed from the crew at the last minute. Greg couldn't believe something of this importance had been overlooked. For such a mighty ship with so many people aboard and crossing in a particularly perilous path, this just didn't make sense. But not wanting to be fined for breaking into the ship's property, Greg let it slide, hoping that they wouldn't need the binoculars in the end. Ultimately, if there were icebergs expected, a warning call would be made to the captain, informing of any concerns. Little did Greg know that a warning had been received, notifying of the dangers that awaited. But the telegram didn't provide the required prefix, which would have ensured direct delivery to the captain. So, the critical warning was just overlooked. John and his crew below decks prepared for departure, stoking the engines. He noticed an essence of thick exhaust, far too heavy than what would be expected from the furnaces. The crew searched throughout the lower decks. Following a thorough search, they managed to locate the cause of the exhaust. It was an ignited pile of coal within a coal bunker. Unknown when it had ignited, a buildup of coal had clearly been smoldering, slowly growing in size. The amount of smoldering coal was concerning. The alarm was raised, alerting an officer to review the matter. The officer assessed the damage and confirmed with the captain that it was deemed to be of little concern, as only minor damage had been caused. John was unsure of this assessment, as he knew that in confined spaces, surrounded by iron bulkheads, an oven-like environment arises that intensifies the heat with time. But the Titanic would power forward, making no sense to John as they had only just departed from Southampton. He was sure they would have turned back. John and his crew were ordered to shovel the already lit coal into the furnace and continue shoveling until all the smoldering contents would be contained. It was a possible but painstaking task that could take the entire journey. The continuous intake of coal would ensure the turbines would spin at a constant, accelerated pace, not what the Titanic was designed for. It was meant to be a luxurious passenger liner and not for breaking speed records. However, the crew would find enthusiasm in not only acknowledging the Titanic as unsinkable, but also as the fastest. John and his crew continued to shovel the coal into the furnace for several days. The temperature within the bow was becoming hotter every day. The bulkhead's contained heat was so severe that it became weak at the seams in the iron walls and rivets. "2 more days, lads, just 2 more days!" John was laughing, trying to raise the spirits of his mates as they were working tirelessly. But as they were all laughing, joking, and looking forward to dry land, they unknowingly approached their final destination. The Titanic was speeding through the calm sea. Greg looked ahead, above in the lookout tower, keeping a keen eye out as they were in iceberg territory now. Even though the way seemed clear, false horizons could occur, creating confusion about how far objects in the distance truly were. As they were traveling in the Gulf Stream waters into the colder Labrador Current, air columns cooled from the bottom upwards, creating a thermal inversion. This incredibly high air pressure ensured fog wasn't present, providing a deceptively clear outlook. But the thermal inversion can also create optical illusions, showing the horizon further away, appearing higher in the distance, or masking whatever objects that could come before it. These false horizons could easily hide any icebergs that could be approaching. Greg knew the perils of a calm sea in the Arctic, preferring the rough waters, where it's easier to detect icebergs within waves. Peering from the lookout, Greg was looking towards the dark abyss ahead. Suddenly, within 1 mile directly in front, a formidable image quickly emerged from the dark waters surrounding. "Iceberg right ahead!" Greg yelled to his mate, who quickly called to the helm and directed them to steer hard to starboard. The helmsman received the call. In the heat of the moment, he turned the wheel counterclockwise. He then realized he'd turned the wheel the wrong way and quickly went in the opposite direction. The ship aimed towards the iceberg, veering to the port side whilst reducing speed. Although there was a delay in turning the wheel, since there was a short distance from the signal and the fast pace that they sailed at, it may not have made a difference. As they approached the iceberg, it appeared as though they'd miss it, but over 87% of an iceberg is underwater. And as they came along the side, the hidden ice underneath hit the port side bow, piercing the side of the hull with a 12-square-foot tear. The ship shook, with all aboard aware that something was amiss. Amongst the confusion and fear, they were oblivious of the damage. As they gathered their bearings, 6 out of 16 compartments were quickly filling up with seawater. The hull could only withstand 4 compartments filling before sinking. Time was ticking as the Titanic made its descent into the depths. The weakened bulkhead with heated steel pillars and rivets broke under the pressure and sudden change of temperature from the ice-cold water. The call was made to abandon the ship. Lifeboats were prepared to be released, while help signals were sent out to nearby ships. The radio operator was guiltily sitting, constantly calling out to a nearby ship that had been in contact with the Titanic recently. There was steady communication with this ship over the past few days, providing warnings of icebergs since the Titanic departed from Southampton. The final warning message received was just 1 hour ago. Upon receiving the final warning, the operator ignorantly responded, "Shut up," with the assumption that their warnings of icebergs were pointless. Following this unfortunate response, the ship turned their radio off and provided radio silence. The closest ship that was responding to their distress signals was 500 miles away, too far to provide any assistance in time. There were countless mistakes that caused the Titanic's watery end, whether they contributed directly or from sheer ignorance. The most tragic of them was the number of people aboard the ship, 2,224 of them. There were only enough lifeboats provided to rescue 1,178, barely half of the people. It's April 10th, 1912, a sunny spring day. You're one of the first-class passengers aboard the Titanic, just as the ship is about to depart from Southampton. Imagine everyone's excitement, fresh spring air, the sounds of the sea. You're strolling along the highest deck of the Titanic when you notice several lifeboats. As you start counting the boats, you recall the ship's capacity. It's just over 3,000 people. Wait, but are there enough lifeboats for everyone aboard? Let's look into the numbers. The Titanic could carry a needed total of 64 lifeboats, a number which could have easily helped to save all the passengers on board. Chief designer Alexander Carlisle planned to equip the ship with 48 lifeboats, but the Titanic ended up with a mere 20. The fact that this number of lifeboats wasn't enough for all the passengers was not illegal at the time. This was because the number of lifeboats required was calculated based on the tonnage of a ship, not her passenger capacity. Speaking of the Titanic, this number of boats was chosen for aesthetic reasons, to make the decks look less crowded to the ship's elite and high-class passengers. After the final decision on the lifeboats was taken, Carlisle quit his job. Passengers' strolls on the Titanic's decks were pleasing to the eye, but were they worth it in the end? In 2012, a century after the wreck, new documents related to the scandalous lack of lifeboats were uncovered. It appears that a safety inspector named Maurice Clark proposed the addition of at least 10 more lifeboats 5 hours before the ship was supposed to set sail. But since the ship's owners clearly wanted to leave on time, his plea was overlooked. He was also warned that unless he kept this secret, he would be fired. In retrospect, had the owners followed his advice, an estimated 700 more people might have survived that night. The 20 lifeboats you counted, those that actually made it on board, could have carried only a third of the passengers, even at their full capacity. But tragically, some of them were launched with as few as 12 people when they could have easily saved up to 65 people each. To add to the disaster, the Titanic's crew members were not properly trained on using the lifeboat launching equipment. That's why the boats were launched slowly, improperly, and sometimes without the right supervision. Out of the 20 lifeboats, only 18 were set afloat correctly. Also, passengers were not informed about safety measures. A lifeboat drill should have taken place on the 14th of April, but the captain eventually canceled the event. One of the many myths surrounding the Titanic and its catastrophic ending is also related to the lack of the necessary number of lifeboats. There was no maritime law at the time that said women and children should get into lifeboats first, but it was a universally accepted custom in such types of situations as a shipwreck. Shortly after the Titanic had sunk in the icy Atlantic waters, rumors started to spread. It was said that some desperate men had resorted to dressing up as women in those final moments before midnight on April 14, 1912. They wanted to get a spot on the lifeboats and have a chance to save their lives. At the same time, there's little to no evidence that any of the male passengers of the Titanic had actually done this. In any case, what happened to those 20 lifeboats that were on board the Titanic after the ship hit the iceberg? What we do know is that all these boats were launched between 12:40 a.m. and 2:15 a.m., with a total of 718 people on board. By the time they were rescued by the RMS Carpathia at about 4 a.m. the same day, only 705 people had remained alive. It took the crew of the RMS Carpathia more than 4 hours and 30 minutes to pick up all the passengers and 13 of the lifeboats. This was as many as the rescue ship was allowed to carry. The rest of the now empty lifeboats were left adrift at sea. Those salvaged were later given back to the White Star Line, the British shipping company which operated the Titanic. Strangely, after being returned, they appeared to have vanished from official records. The last image ever taken of the 13 surviving lifeboats was of them getting unloaded in the New York harbor. Sadly, and ironically, that's where the Titanic was supposed to be on April 18, 1912. The lifeboats were then rid of their Titanic nameplates or any other markings that could have linked them to the ship. Some sources claim that the boats were eventually destroyed. But was this actually the truth? The fate of one particular lifeboat has been the source of much debate. Collapsible Boat A, the last one to leave the ship, was retrieved by the RMS Oceanic a month after the crash. At that time, it was a shocking 200 miles away from the spot where the Titanic had sunk. Also, in the boat, there was a wedding band engraved with the words "Edward to Gerda," a sad omen to a couple that were lost at sea after managing to escape the sinking Titanic. Later identified as Edward and Gerda Lindell, the couple was traveling from Sweden to the U.S. to relocate. Some accounts claimed that Mr. Lindell did, in fact, make it to Collapsible Boat A, but his wife wasn't as lucky. Neither were ever seen again, and the wedding band was eventually sent to Gerda's father. The recovery of Collapsible Boat A was recorded in both photographs taken by the crew on board the RMS Oceanic and by a detailed handwritten account of a fellow passenger. They claimed that the lifeboat had looked more like a piece of wood carried by the waves than an actual boat. The first lifeboat to depart from the Titanic was Lifeboat Number 7. It was dubbed the Millionaire Lifeboat. It's rumored that the 12 passengers on board might have bribed the crew to row away to safety instead of allowing others to jump in. In 2015, some of the items recovered from this lifeboat, including a lunch menu, a ticket, and a letter from one of the passengers, were auctioned for up to $70,000 by a New York auctioneer. Soon after the Titanic catastrophe, it became mandatory for all ships to be equipped with enough lifeboats to carry all the passengers and crew. It's more likely that the Titanic lifeboats, being relatively new equipment at the time, were refitted to be used on other ships, such as the RMS Olympic, which was the Titanic's older sister. Some of them may have been sold off to private collections, or even left to rot. After all, they were seen as a source of bad luck, and most people were unwilling to use them again on other ships. Unfortunately, all the information about their whereabouts is hard to confirm now. No official statement from the owners of the lifeboats was ever given after their rescue. But although nothing appears to have remained of the original lifeboats, some full-sized replicas exist on display in museums in Falmouth, England, and Belfast, Northern Ireland. One of the few surviving White Star Line lifeboats did not, in fact, belong to the Titanic, but it did have a striking connection to the cursed ship. This boat is the restored Lifeboat 6 from the RMS Oceanic, which helped to recover Titanic's collapsible Lifeboat C. It was said to be owned by a private collector, but similar to the Titanic's lifeboats, we don't know anything about its location today. As for the nameplates and other identification marks of the lifeboats, the White Star Line seems to have kept them. Because some of these items were later auctioned and sold to interested collectors, even Rick Springfield supposedly got hold of one of the nameplates. One particular nameplate was already missing by the time the White Star Line employees had reached the lifeboats. It was the nameplate of Lifeboat Number 8, which had been taken by a sailor named Thomas Jones. He later gifted it to another Titanic survivor, the Countess of Rothes, along with a letter acknowledging the bond they formed on the night of the shipwreck. You can find other similar items on display in different museums, such as Larne Museum and Arts Centre in Northern Ireland, or Worcester City Art Gallery and Museum. To be fair, some experts claim that even if there had been more lifeboats on board the Titanic, there simply might not have been enough time to launch them all. That's how severe the impact was. Many researchers say that everything was happening so rapidly after the ship had hit the iceberg that it's astonishing that so many passengers managed to survive. It was the start of 1912. A giant chunk of ice broke off a glacier in southwest Greenland. The ice was made up of snow that had fallen thousands of years before the event, perhaps as far back as when mammoths still roamed the earth. The iceberg started its journey. It was a huge thing, more than 1,700 feet long and weighing over 75 million tons. It was also a very peaceful chunk of ice. It steered clear of ships and busy transport routes. And then, it somehow floated much further south than other bergs did. Our iceberg was lucky. Others melt long before they get to these low latitudes. Out of up to 30,000 icebergs that drift away from Greenland's glaciers, only 1% ever make it all the way to the Atlantic. Even after melting into the water for months, this massive block of ice was still almost twice as heavy as the Golden Gate Bridge. The iceberg's top part was towering 10 stories over the ocean surface. Several days before our iceberg made it to the Atlantic Ocean, a magnificent ship left port. It was a luxury liner carrying more than 3,000 passengers and crew members. At that time, it was the largest ship ever built. It was the Titanic. The collisions happened on April 14th, when the ship was in the North Atlantic, 370 miles away from Newfoundland. Unable to divert its course, the ship ruptured at least 5 of its hull compartments. They started to fill with water at an alarming speed. The Titanic's compartments weren't capped at the top. That's why the water spilled over and started to flood each succeeding one. The front of the ship began to sink, causing the back part to lift vertically into the air. And then, with a deafening roar, the liner broke in half. The rest is history. But what happened to the iceberg after that? On April 15th, the German ocean liner SS Prinz Adalbert was sailing through the North Atlantic. It was traveling a few miles away from the place where the Titanic had sunk several hours prior. The German ship's chief steward, who hadn't learned about the disaster yet, saw an iceberg. What drew his attention was a large streak of red paint going along the iceberg's base. Surprised, the man took a photo of his discovery. He thought the paint meant a ship had hit the iceberg within the past 12 hours. The next person who saw the iceberg and took another photo of it was the captain of a vessel laying deep-sea telecommunication cables. The ship was sent to help in the area where the Titanic had sunk. The captain later claimed the iceberg he'd seen had been the only one in that area, plus the red paint. It wasn't difficult to connect the dots. In 2015, one of these photos sold at auction for over $32,000. And still, experts are unsure whether the image really shows the infamous block of ice. It might be a simple iceberg that had been floating nearby at that time. The great unsinkable ship was gone, sunk into the bottom of the North Atlantic, where it remains to this day. But the iceberg continued on its way, perplexing a few witnesses and slowly melting into the surrounding water. It would vanish completely before the end of the year.
April 14, 1912. The Titanic crashed into a huge iceberg and sank. Yep, we've covered that. But what if this time we use the ice to bring the ship to the surface? This requires several thousand feet of wire mesh and a lot of liquid nitrogen. Our goal is to put the Titanic in a huge block of ice that will raise the ship to the surface. Now to do this, you need to wrap the wreck in a wire mesh and cover it with liquid nitrogen. The first problem you face is the inability to wrap the ship completely. You need to somehow lift the ship a little to put the mesh under it. Let's say that by some miracle you manage to do so. Next, you need to transport hundreds of large tanks of liquid nitrogen. You're underwater, opening the tanks, and it's so cold that the icy water of the Atlantic Ocean looks like it's boiling. The nitrogen just sizzles, dissipates, and certainly doesn't create a block of ice around the mesh. Alright, new attempt. Raise the Titanic with the help of huge magnets. For this, you need a large cruiser and some powerful magnets. You attach thick cables to the magnets and lower them to the bottom. Bright projectors illuminate the black ocean depths. Parts of the wreck are visible. The magnets descend lower and cling to the iron hull of the ship. The cruiser pulls the cables and magnets up. Some of them detach from the Titanic as the iron surface is covered with reefs and corals. Some parts of the wreck break away from the ship and rise. The power of the cruiser is not enough. One of the cables is torn. Not only the weight of the individual parts of the Titanic, but also the colossal water pressure interferes with the operation. The sunken ship can't be raised completely, only its small parts. In reality, there has already been an attempt to raise the Titanic in parts. The $5 million operation failed. Nylon slings were attached to a large part of the wreck. The other ends of the slings were connected to the diesel engines. For the entire operation, they used a mini submarine. A piece of the Titanic weighing 21 tons was pulled up, but one of the slings broke because of the strong water pressure. Then, one by one, the other cables began to snap, and a huge piece fell back to the seafloor. By this time, all the participants of the rescue operation had run out of food supplies, and it was far from the nearest shore, so they decided not to make a second attempt. A book was written and a movie was made about how the Titanic was lifted with compressed air. In reality, no one even attempted this operation. To do this, you'd need several hundred large cylinders of compressed air. At first, you install them inside the Titanic's hull and wait for them to pull the ship to the surface. As soon as you lower the cylinders under the water, they immediately float upwards. This greatly complicates the operation. You need to fasten the cylinders with cables and pull them down to the bottom using a powerful submarine, or better yet, several of them. Because of the high pressure, the cylinders might burst. In this case, the blast wave would hit other cylinders and provoke a catastrophe. Too expensive and unsafe. The most expensive and complex plan to raise the Titanic is probably the one where scientists somehow extract hydrogen and oxygen from the ocean water. Then, these extracted elements must fill special containers. Those containers are attached to the ship, and the Titanic would rise to the surface. Even if you extract oxygen and hydrogen from millions of tons of water, the rest of the ocean water will replace it. A machine that will be capable of such filtering should cost billions of dollars. Or you can come up with a chemical element that will use a chain reaction to purify all the water. In this case, the entire world ocean will be left without vital oxygen. Someone once suggested blowing up the Titanic. You'd need to lower several boxes of dynamite to the ocean floor. The boxes must be completely sealed to prevent the dynamite from getting wet. Next, you need to run several miles of wire conducting an electrical current to them. Once all this is done, you sail to a safe distance. Now, you're going to press the button to pass the current through the wire and activate the dynamite. 3, 2, 1, stop! Why would you do this? Even if it works, the wreckage of the Titanic will be scattered in all directions on the seabed. It will be impossible to lift the Titanic from the ocean. Imagine a huge hook that can fetch the Titanic and lift it from the bottom like a fish. This hook must be huge to pick up a sunken ship. Let's say you created it. Next, you're on a huge cruiser, sailing up to the crash site and lowering the hook down like an anchor. It falls right on the Titanic but doesn't cling to it. You need special equipment to attach a bus-sized hook to the Titanic. It would include a huge submarine with mechanical arms. To build such a device and make it work under enormous pressure is already next to impossible. But let's say you finally managed to hook the Titanic. It's then you realize the cruiser doesn't have enough power to lift the ship, weighing more than 50 tons, and the hook that adds about 10 tons more. To complete your task, you'll need a few more cruisers and a few extra $1 million. Once hot wax cools, it hardens and floats on the water surface. What if we deliver it to the ocean floor and pour it inside the Titanic? This may work, given that wax is not an expensive material. So, you melt the wax, pour it into strong tanks, and pull them to the bottom with the help of a submarine. The tanks can withstand enormous pressure, and the submarine has enough power to lower the wax to such a depth. The containers are placed inside the Titanic. Through a remote control, you open the containers, but the wax doesn't pour out. The deeper you go, the colder the water gets. While you were delivering the containers to the ship, the wax was cooling down and getting solid inside. Several containers are pressed against the top of the ship, but it's not enough to lift the Titanic. Other containers simply float away to the surface. And even if the containers were thermostatic and kept hot inside all the time, once released, the wax would solidify in an instant. There would just be no time for it to spread and cover the Titanic from within, so it would just float up as well. Alright, you fill several large and sturdy bags with Vaseline. This substance acts just like wax in the cold. It gets solid and floats. You want to put bags all over the Titanic and just wait for the Vaseline to bring it up. You load the bags into the submarine and descend to the ocean floor. Some parts of the ship can't be reached because of the clinging corals. You decide to unload all the bags in one place, but as soon as you take Vaseline out of the submarine, the bags tear due to the strong pressure. Solid pieces of Vaseline float up, pushed by the water. Mission failed. The craziest idea is to fill the Titanic with millions of ping pong balls. Small plastic balls filled with air should push the ship to the surface. But as soon as you start to lower them to the bottom, the plastic immediately flattens and all the air from the balls pops out. You can deliver the balls inside a submarine, but once you put them inside the Titanic, the pressure will crush them again. Also, you can create balls made from strong ultralight material and fill them with air. In this case, you will need much more money. As soon as you put the balls inside the ship, some of them will immediately slip through the holes in the ship, and the remaining ones won't be enough to lift the wreck weighing more than 50 tons from the bottom. Well, to study the Titanic, you don't need to go down to the ocean floor. On the internet, you can find a detailed 3D map that shows the wreck site, as well as the ship itself on the seabed. To get a realistic picture of the Titanic, researchers used sonar technologies and underwater robots, which took more than 10,000 pictures of the sunken ship. So, what do you think? Leave it alone? Yeah, me too. April 14th, 1912. The dark night was filled with horrible sounds of a giant metal vessel breaking into two. The largest ship of that time collided with an iceberg that was on its way. The Titanic, one of the biggest stories of the 20th century that people still talk about. The starboard side of the giant vessel brushed up against the iceberg. It was 11:40 p.m. when things started going wrong. This iceberg caused enough damage for at least 5 watertight compartments in the hull to start filling with water. The crew immediately began a brief investigation to see if they could do anything and fix things. They had no one to rely on, all alone in the darkness of the cold night, far away from the land. The North Atlantic Ocean, around 400 miles south of Newfoundland, Canada. They needed time to figure out how to bring people to safety. They had some time, true, but not enough. If you watched the movie, you know the ship didn't plunge immediately after the icy doom had happened. The whole process lasted a good 2 hours and 40 minutes. But the situation was hard. There were 2,200 people to take care of, including crew and passengers, and things happening on the ship were chaotic. The chief designer, Thomas Andrews, soon realized they wouldn't be able to stay afloat. By midnight, the entire crew had begun preparing the lifeboats for launch. They had 20 boats with space for only 1,178 people, which was just a bit more than 50% of the people on board. The order was to get women and children to safety first. Crewmen were there to row and guide the boats. The scene over the next 2 hours gradually started escalating. The crew members had a task to wake up passengers and warn them something bad was happening. They wanted to place them into a fleet of lifeboats as soon as possible. At 12:15 a.m., some crew members sent out a distress signal. A steamship called Frankfurt was among the first ones that received the message and responded, but they were about 170 nautical miles away. Some other ships also got the message and offered their assistance, but sadly, they were too far away as well. At 12:20 a.m., the Cunard liner Carpathia got a distress signal from the Titanic and changed its course right away. They were 58 miles away at the time, and it would take them more than 3 hours to get there. 20 minutes later, the crew was lowering the first lifeboat. It was carrying only 27 passengers, although it had room for 65. Many of the lifeboats that were launched first were well below capacity. Crew members were worried, thinking the Davids wouldn't be able to hold a fully loaded lifeboat. And in the beginning, many passengers were just too afraid to leave the ship. They still thought Titanic was unsinkable and couldn't imagine the scenario that was going to happen 1 to 2 hours later. The crew was firing the first of 8 distress rockets. Unsuccessful. No one was close enough to help. By 1:20 a.m., they lowered 10 lifeboats. Number 8 had only 28 people in it. One of the passengers on the number 10 was 9-week-old Melvina Dean. She would later become the last survivor who lived until 2009 and turned 97. It was 2 a.m. already. 3 of the collapsible boats were the only lifeboats that remained on the ship. The bow of the vessel had sunk low and had tipped far under the surface. People around it could now clearly see stern propellers above the water. Crew members were lowering collapsible lifeboat D from the roof of the officers' quarters with over 20 passengers in it. As the ship's bow went under, the water was washing collapsible A from the deck. Those 20 people were struggling because their boat was partly filled with water. As crew members were trying to release collapsible B, it fell. Before they righted it, the water swept it off the ship. 30 passengers still managed to find safety on the overturned lifeboat. At 2:17 a.m., the ship's wireless operator decided to transmit one last distress call. A minute later, the light on the ship finally went out. Titanic and all left on board plunged into darkness. The bow continued to sink, and the stern was rising higher above the surface, which placed great strain on the midsection. Horrible sounds were filling the night. Titanic, this massive, legendary ship so many people placed their hopes in and were excited about, broke into 2 between the 3rd and 4th funnels. Reports would speculate it took about 6 minutes for the bow section to reach the ocean bottom. The stern settled back in the water before it rose again into a vertical position. It remained in this situation until it finally disappeared into the ocean. At 2:20 a.m., The stern apparently retained air inside, and water pressure crushed it as it went down. The stern landed about 2,000 feet away from the bow. People consider the Titanic the fastest ship in the world. They thought it was unsinkable because 4 of its compartments could be flooded, and that still wouldn't cause a critical loss of buoyancy. Its life was problematic since its beginning. While the ship was leaving port, it moved within a couple of feet of the steamer New York. It managed to safely pass by, which was a huge relief for all those worried passengers massed on the ship's decks. Titanic sailed off on the 10th of April. Its first journey was across the highly competitive Atlantic route. On the launch day, the Titanic became the biggest movable object in the history of humankind, 882 feet long, 92 feet wide. Not that big if you compare it with today's ships. The biggest cruise ship in the world today is Royal Caribbean's Symphony of the Seas, which is roughly 5 times the size of Titanic. If you put that ship in a vertical position, it would be nearly as tall as the Empire State Building, which is 1,250 feet without antennas. But Titanic was a huge attraction back in its time. At one moment of their journey, they stopped in France, after which they made another stop in Ireland. Once the final passengers boarded, the massive ship set out at full speed for their final destination, New York City. 4 days after the beginning of its journey, Titanic failed to divert its course from a huge iceberg, the story we all know about. Only 700 people survived, and most of them were women and children. The night was extremely cold, 1 hour and 20 minutes after Titanic had gone down to the bottom of the ocean. Survivors weren't even sure someone was coming to save them. Finally, they saw the light. It was Carpathia coming towards them. They came for the people in the lifeboats. The crew brought them aboard and pulled a handful of other passengers out of the water. Many ships tried to contact Titanic a few hours after it sank. Their messages were never returned. Later, when there was an investigation of what really happened, they discovered the Leyland liner California had been less than 20 miles away when Titanic was sinking. But the crew didn't hear the distress signals coming from Titanic because their radio operator was off duty. Countries from both sides of the Atlantic were shocked and horrified when they heard details of what happened to Titanic. They decided to make changes to ship operations, rules that would help avoid such events in the future. They held the first International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea, where they adopted rules for every ship to have lifeboat space for each passenger on board. Also, lifeboat drills became mandatory. They also decided to establish an international ice patrol. Its main role was to monitor icebergs in the North Atlantic shipping lanes. Ships also needed to maintain a 24-hour radio watch. Titanic wasn't built alone. Because of the size of this magnificent ship and all the new equipment it required, it would have been too expensive as a one-off. So the team built the Titanic alongside 2 sister ships, and both of them had eventful lifetimes. RMS Olympic came first. It was launched in 1910, and for a whole year was the biggest liner in the world. The Britannic was another sister ship that sailed for a while before it too ended down on the ocean bottom. But only Titanic became a legend and one of the most fascinating stories of modern history.
The night was dark and scary. A few hundred people were sitting in lifeboats, not knowing what would happen next or what their lives would look like from that moment on. All they knew was the giant ship they had been sailing on just a couple of hours earlier disappeared in front of their eyes. They were alone, waiting for help. Is anyone even coming? They had no idea if the rest of the ships that were traveling relatively close to them had heard their call for help. There was nothing else to do but wait. The Titanic, an iceberg, and one night. April 14th, 1912. It's one of the most famous stories from modern history that everyone talks about, even now, more than 100 years later. The 16 lifeboats on board could only accommodate a little more than 50%, 1,178 people, of the total number of passengers that were on board. And many of them were still half empty. In one of them, there was a little 2-month-old girl, Milvina Dean, the youngest passenger on board the giant ship. Her parents had decided to leave England because they wanted to build a better life in the United States. Her father had some family in Kansas, and he hoped they could start their own business there. The Dean family didn't actually choose to be on board this giant legendary liner, but because of a coal strike, they got transferred there, so they boarded it at Southampton as third-class passengers. Milvina's father felt when their ship hit the iceberg on that cold and seemingly peaceful night. He immediately went up to investigate. When he saw that people were panicking and that the crew members were giving warnings on the actual danger of the situation, he rushed to their cabin to find his wife. He told her to dress the children and quickly go up on deck. The crew members gave the order to get the lifeboats ready and start transferring women and children there first. It was a chance for at least some family members to get to safety. Milvina, her mother, and her brother got in Lifeboat 10. They were among the first off the liner out of the 706 crew members and passengers who managed to escape the sinking ship. Later, the liner called Carpathia heard their call for help, came for the passengers, and took them to New York. Her father, unfortunately, stayed behind them and didn't manage to save himself. Milvina grew up in Ashurst, England, which wasn't far from where she set sail on the ship. She spent her life working as a secretary and an assistant in small businesses in Southampton. She never married. Milvina always used to say she never spoke about the whole Titanic thing because she remembered nothing about it, so she didn't want people to think she was just drawing attention to herself. But in 1985, a French-American team got together and located the wreck of the Titanic. It was around 370 miles east of Mistaken Point, Newfoundland, in water that was more than 2 miles deep. That's when they confirmed the ship split in two. For decades, people believed the ship sank in one piece. They thought the only significant damage was the damage the hull got from its contact with the iceberg. In reality, it broke in half, right between its third and fourth funnels. It happened shortly before the ship disappeared under the surface of the water, and the whole thing, starting from the moment when they hit the iceberg, lasted around 2 hours and 40 minutes. People didn't pay that much attention to the Titanic until this team of researchers found the wreck. In the last year of her life, she sold some of her family's possessions at auction to pay for her stay in a nursing home. The items she sold also included a suitcase filled with clothes that her family got when they arrived in the US, and compensation letters her mom got from the Titanic Relief Fund. The compensation letters outlined the financial aid that certain passengers received who had survived the loss of their loved ones. She lived until the age of 97 when she caught pneumonia. She was the youngest of the 705 people that survived the whole event. The Titanic was the world's largest ship. Since it was so big, some thought the vessel should have had 4 exhaust stacks. But Thomas Andrews, the man who designed the ship, believed that only 3 were necessary. So, the Titanic basically had one purely decorative stack. 2,200 people were on board when the ship sank. There were 908 crew members, and the maximum number of passengers on board, which was 3,500. As you probably saw in the movie, there were different classes of passengers. The estimated overall wealth of those in first class was about $500 million, and researchers estimated $6 million worth of things went down to the ocean bottom, together with the ship. In first class, this liner was a place of luxury. It had 4 restaurants, 2 libraries, 2 barber shops, reading rooms, and a photographic darkroom on board. There was also a heated swimming pool, but only first-class passengers could use it, at a price of 1 shilling a time. The ship also had Turkish baths and electric baths, and passengers could use each for 4 shillings at a time. The cost to build this massive giant was $7.5 million, but that was back in 1912. Today, It would be about $200 million. First-class tickets cost $2,560 at the time, which is today's equivalent of $61,000. What would you get in these expensive cabins? A sitting room, 2 bedrooms, 2 wardrobe rooms, and a bathroom. Would you pay that much for those luxuries? Teams of researchers still haven't explored many areas on the Titanic. It's still very, very hard to access them with underwater vehicles. There was a lifeboat drill scheduled for the same day the Titanic sank, but it was called off for some reason. The crew had done just one lifeboat drill, and that was when the ship was still docked. But even if the crew members had been properly trained and each lifeboat had been filled, the capacity was still not enough to save each and every passenger. The Titanic was the biggest movable object in the world at that time. On May 31st, 1911, its immense hull made its way down the slipways and ended up in the River Lagan in Belfast. Over 100,000 people were there to see the launch, which took just a little more than a minute and went off without a hitch. The people who were in charge of the ship immediately towed the hull to a mammoth fitting-out dock. Thousands of workers spent most of the next year there working hard, building the decks and constructing all those luxury interiors that gave the Titanic its specific look. They were also installing the 29 giant boilers that would power the ship's 2 main steam engines. All that to get the title unsinkable. The ship had more than just one fatal flaw. You may have heard of one of its design flaws. The airtight bulkheads weren't completely sealed on top. This allowed water to flow from one compartment to another, which eventually sank the liner. And Titanic had more flaws. High sulfur content, cold temperatures, and high speeds largely affected the steel of the vessel's hull and the iron of its rivets. The steel here shattered, while the rivets popped out relatively easily. This was the reason the Titanic sunk 24 times faster than we'd expect. There are many theories about what really led to the sinking of such a giant. And one says a full moon from a couple of months before could be one of the reasons. It may have created very strong tides that sent a flotilla of icebergs southward. This was right in time for the Titanic's maiden voyage. Research says an optical illusion prevented the ship from getting help. One famous British historian, Tim Moulton, thought the atmosphere on the night of the sinking created specific conditions that made it very hard for the crew members to spot icebergs. They partially caused something called superrefraction. The extraordinary bending of light causes miraging, and several ships in the area recorded it. Not only did this prevent the crew from seeing the troublesome iceberg in time, but it also stopped one of the ships that could have offered help from identifying the call for help and communicating with the Titanic crew. Also, some say the ship was traveling too fast. From the start, they blamed the skipper for sailing such a big liner at such a high speed, 22 knots, through the cold and unpredictable waters of the North Atlantic, which was full of hidden icebergs. Can you guess how many theories of the Titanic's sinking exist? Right, loads, including a theory of my own, which I'm going to share with you today. And then you can decide which one seems most likely to you. One Piece theory. The very first version of the events was the One Piece theory. It's very simple and basically claims that the sinking happened without any breakups. 2:15 a.m., the ship collides with an iceberg. 2:18 a.m., the lights go out. The ship reaches an angle of 45 degrees and then quickly begins its final plunge into the ocean depths. 2:20 a.m., only about 3 minutes later, the RMS Titanic disappears under the surface of the ocean for good. The liner doesn't break, it just goes down as a whole piece. Of course, this can't be true. In April 1912, the Titanic was not only the largest ship in the world, but also the largest ship ever built. It's hard to believe that such a heavy vessel could have gone down without breaking. That's just impossible. Well, I mean, you can't blame the theorists. Before we found the wreckage, there were no other theories. Wait a minute, or were there? The day after the disaster, the survivors gave their interviews. They talked about what had happened, and some of them claimed that the ship had actually broken in two when it had been flooded. For example, Jack Thayer, a 17-year-old boy, outlined the sinking as he remembered it, and L.D. Skidmon drew a sketch based on his description. The picture clearly showed the ship breaking in half. But no one believed Jack or other witnesses. There was no evidence, so their claims were received with a grain of salt. But in 1985, things changed. First breakup theory. That's when Robert Ballard found the wreckage of the Titanic in the depths of the ocean. When people saw the wreckage, it became clear that Jack and the other survivors had been right. The Titanic did indeed break in two when it sank. So it's time for a new theory. 2:15 a.m. The keel breaks, the starboard list eases, and the hull continues to bow and crumble. 2:17 a.m. The galley sections break off. The towers immediately drop under their own weight. The lights go out. The stern is pulled into the air. The bow breaks off and starts sinking. The aft is barely hanging on to the starboard side of the stern section superstructure. The stern section slowly lists over to port as it begins sinking again. It rises up one last time and pivots in a semicircle as it sinks. It all sounds pretty convincing, right? But people began to find plot holes in this theory. For example, the Titanic couldn't have held together until it reached such a high angle. The breakup would have had to begin much earlier. This only meant there was still a vast field for research and speculations. So people started to come up with their own possible scenarios. How about we look first at the ones no one likes? V-break and Aaron 1912 V-break. According to the first breakup theory, the Titanic reached a high angle, and the weight of its unsupported stern caused it to crack from the top down. But it's physically impossible. So, are there any other ideas? In 2006, Roger Long, a naval architect, decided to research a so-called V theory. 2:17 a.m. The breakup begins at a shallow angle, perhaps as little as 11 degrees. The upper structure fails and starts to crack. At this moment, only its double bottom is holding the Titanic together, but it starts to bend under the strain too, failing the ship. Water is pouring through the crack. It increases the weight in between the two sections, bending the Titanic the other way and pulling it into shape somewhat resemblant to the letter V. The upper decks get mangled and bent together. The bow heads for the bottom, and the stern is the last to sink. This theory has since been disproven many times, though. Roger Long believed it because the broken edges of the upper decks in the Titanic's bow section were all mangled and crushed. However, we have learned that it happened because of the so-called hydraulic downburst, the force of the water crashing into the deck as the Titanic hit the ocean floor. Another V-break theory states that the bow had risen out of the water after the break. This theory was mainly peddled by one former Titanic enthusiast. But not only has this theory been proved to be physically impossible due to the bow's incredible mass, it was also inspired by incorrect information. Remember Jack Thayer? Well, it was based on his sketch and the words of a couple of passengers. But the truth is, none of them had ever seen the Titanic break down like this. Jack himself even stated in an interview that the sketch was completely out of context to what he had actually seen. It was drawn by a passenger on the Carpathia, the ship that received the Titanic's distress signal and came to its aid. It couldn't be used as evidence. Now that we know this, let's move on to the theories that most people believe in. James Cameron's banana peel theory. Who hasn't seen the legendary movie about the Titanic, right? It became the leader of the 70th Academy Awards ceremony in the number of nominations and awards, and deservedly so. But did you know that James Cameron had been interested in the Titanic for many years and studied the ship's history? His books and research are very detailed, and he even came up with his own version of the events. It's called the banana split theory, and this is actually what you could see in the movie. Here's how it goes. The Titanic reaches a 23-degree angle and fractures down to the keel. The double bottom acts as a hinge as the stern falls down. When the double bottom fails, the bow and the stern separate. The stern lists to port, standing vertically, and then begins to go underwater. This theory is the most scientifically accurate one, along with Roy Mengat's theory. Wait, who's Roy Mengat? Mengat theory. Roy Mengat was an engineer who came up with the most plausible theory for the time being. 2:17 a.m. The lights go out on the Titanic. At this moment, the ship is at an angle of 20 to 23 degrees. Suddenly, the vessel snaps in two just around the third funnel. It causes the stern to settle into the water. The keel fails first. The draft and lower hull are crushed and break apart. Water surges into the bow and stern of the ship through the huge cracks, causing the bow section to sink beneath the waves. The stern rises up to the angle of 70 to 90 degrees, and then it sinks too. This theory seems to make the most sense, but it's quite controversial. The survivors who saw the breakup stated that the stern had settled back with the bow completely missing. Mengat's theory, however, contradicts that statement, while James Cameron's scenario takes this into account. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? The truth must be somewhere in the middle. My version. Now, as promised, I'll provide you with my version of the events. Well, it's not really my theory, more like a combination of Roy Mengat's and James Cameron's ones. I believe that James Cameron was right about the breakup. 2:17 a.m. The ship is at a high angle. The lights go out. Then it snaps into two pieces. The bow starts sinking. The double bottom is still attached to the stern for a minute or so. Once the double bottom fails, the two parts separate and the bow goes down. Then, as Mengat said, the stern rises up at a high angle, and then it begins to sink vertically. It might have actually happened because the survivors stated that they had seen a clean break. This means it couldn't be hidden. And they had also seen the stern staying vertically in the air for a long enough time, probably a few minutes, before disappearing. Anyways, all of these are just speculations. Regardless of how the Titanic broke apart and sank, it was a great tragedy. It's already been 110 years since the Titanic collided with an iceberg and sank. Did you know that in 2022, the Blue Star Line Company is completing the construction of an exact replica of the Titanic? Called the Titanic II liner, the ship will be sent sailing along the same route with 2,400 people on board. Let's hope that everything goes well for them.
We've lived together for many years. Where you go, I go.
These were the words Ida Strauss said to her husband. One of the richest women on the Titanic didn't end up in a lifeboat. Ida chose to stay behind with her beloved Isidore. Moments earlier, she gave her maid a precious gift that probably saved her life. Isidore and Ida Strauss were both born in Germany and emigrated to the United States as kids. They met in New York and got married 5 years later. The couple had 7 children, but luckily, none of them were on the Titanic. Isidore worked for his father's shop in his late teens. Then, he started a china and porcelain business with his brother that grew into the glassware department at Macy's. Eventually, the brothers took over the entire department store and became multi-millionaires. Isidore and Ida were well known in New York for their wealth, charity, and their incredible love and devotion to each other. Whenever Isidore went on a business trip around the States or to Europe, his wife would go with him. When she couldn't, they'd write long letters to each other every day. The couple visited their native Germany every now and again, too. In 1912, they escaped the bone-chilling New York winter and headed for Europe. By that time, they'd already been married for 40 years. They mostly spent time in sunny southern France and also stopped by Isidore's hometown. In early April, it was time for them to sail back home to New York. They normally traveled on one of those huge German liners they had back then. This time, though, everyone was talking about the new luxury liner, the RMS Titanic. They couldn't resist it and immediately bought up some sweet first-class tickets. On April 10th, they boarded the newest ship of the White Star Line. This was going to be great. Ida and Isidore scored one of the 39 private suites at the top of the ship. The tickets cost around $100,000 in today's money. Some of the richest people in the world were staying next to them. The Strausses spent their evenings dining in front of a live orchestra in a hall filled with fancy furniture and expensive wooden paneling. They played chess and backgammon, visited the gym, the swimming pool, even checked out the on-deck squash courts. The luxury didn't last long, though. On the night of April 14th, the ship had its run-in with the most famous iceberg in history. It felt like a slight tremor, a little rumble, that's it. Nobody realized they were in any kind of danger. Passengers even started throwing snowballs made from the chunks of ice that had fallen on the deck. The ship officers told everyone they'd be fine. Moments later, Captain Edward Smith announced it was time to put those life jackets on and get into the lifeboats. All 20 of them were stored on the upper deck. They could have had more, but the ship's designers thought it would make the deck look too messy. There was actually a lifeboat drill scheduled for that day, but instead, they had the real thing. Pretty much only first-class passengers were going to be getting on those lifeboats. The Strausses left their private suite and waited for instructions from the crew. A lot of them were still confident. They told the passengers not to lose their passes. They'd need them when everyone got back on board. That was never going to happen. The ship was going under. The crew announced that women and children would board first. The Strausses were standing next to Lifeboat 8. Mr. Strauss, who was 67 at the time, was offered a seat with his wife because of his age. He refused it, saying he was not too old to sacrifice himself for a woman. He wanted to wait and make sure no women and children were left behind. Ellen Bird, Ida's new maid, hesitated before getting on the lifeboat, but Ida told her to go. There was still room for Ida, and the other first-class women were yelling to her to join them. It took about 10 minutes to load each boat. That's how long Ida had to choose her destiny. She took off her beautiful mink coat and handed it to her shivering maid. Ida said she wouldn't be needing it anymore. But the lifeboat wouldn't leave without her. Sailors tried to grab her and force her on the boat. Meanwhile, the Titanic's orchestra was still playing some pretty upbeat music in the background. Crazy. Ida dodged the sailors' hands and stayed on deck. Isidore was begging for her to go. She refused to leave him, no matter what. All the survivors in Lifeboat 8 remembered her final words about true love in the face of tragedy.
We've lived together for many years. Where you go, I go.
It took a whole hour for the first lifeboat to splash down into the icy water. The last memory of the Titanic for many passengers was Isidore and Ida standing arm in arm on deck. More than 200 first-class passengers survived. Some of them said the Strausses sat down peacefully in 2 deck chairs, holding hands, just waiting. The 25 passengers on Lifeboat 8 spent the rest of the night rowing to safety. They were chasing what they thought were the lights of a ship. It turned out the rescue boat showed up from the opposite direction. They were lucky to be found at all. Many of the passengers, including Ellen Bird, shared the story of Ida and Isidore with reporters, saying it was their most important memory from that horrible night. A month later, around 30,000 people went to their memorial service. Even the mayor of New York showed up. No one seemed surprised the couple gave up their lives for others. Ellen Bird tried to give the famous mink coat back to the Strauss family, but they asked her to keep it in memory of Ida. The only thing that was with the Strausses that night that still exists is a gold and onyx locket. Isidore had it on his pocket watch. The locket had 2 photos in it, one of their oldest son and one of their oldest daughter. The locket was sealed so tight, the photos never got wet. Some of the jewelry from the Titanic stayed intact, even after 70 years. The 1985 expedition found necklaces, rings, brooches, cufflinks, all that kind of stuff. One rusty pocket watch they found had stopped at 1:45 a.m. That was about the time the ship went under. A book collector on the Titanic made sure his mother and her maid got into a lifeboat. He wasn't so lucky. In his luggage was a rare 400-year-old book. This collector was going back to New York after a successful book hunting trip. That little book's lying on the ocean floor somewhere, along with the 7 million pieces of mail the Titanic was transporting. One letter was written by a first-class passenger to his mother the day before the Titanic went down. It was the only letter written on board that survived the icy Atlantic. It was found folded up in a notebook inside a pocket. Another first-class passenger was a German-born chemist. He was traveling to New York to start his own perfume shop. All that was left of him was a bag full of perfume samples. As the Titanic was sinking, violinist Wallace Hartley and his orchestra kept playing to the very end. When Hartley realized he wasn't going to make it, he decided to save the most precious thing he had, his violin. He put it in a leather bag so it would float. 10 days later, they found the violin, damaged by water. His fiancée kept it, and years later, it was sold at auction for $1.7 million. It's still one of the most important Titanic artifacts. The 5 grand pianos on board weren't so lucky. They're still down there somewhere. Divers did manage to recover one piece of sheet music, though. It was a song from a Broadway play. It was still readable, even after more than 70 years underwater. The only car on the Titanic would probably be worth millions today. The Renault CB Coupe belonged to a first-class passenger, William Carter. Obviously, it didn't survive. Carter and his family did survive that horrible night, and even submitted a $5,000 insurance claim on the car. Well, it was brand new and all.
2 legendary athletes who shook up the tennis world had the unfortunate luck of meeting on the unsinkable ship Titanic in 1912. Without realizing it, they'd reunite on the tennis court where they'd be playing against each other. Here's how it all went down, twice. Richard Norris Williams was born in January of 1891 in Geneva. Although he was raised in Switzerland, his parents were American. In fact, he was a distant relative of Benjamin Franklin. In 1912, Williams was just 21 years old and was looking forward to his transatlantic trip to the States after being accepted to study history and geology at Harvard. But before his student life started, he had something else planned. He loved playing tennis and was quite the athlete. So he and his father decided to travel earlier than his mother in order to take part in a few tournaments. Williams and his dad took the train from Geneva to head to Cherbourg, France, where they would board the Titanic. On the way, Williams noticed a familiar face in one of the cars. It was another well-respected tennis player by the name of Carl Bear. The two locked eyes for a moment on the train, not realizing that fate was about to align their lives in an incredible way. Bear was 26 years old at the time. He was born in 1885 in Brooklyn, New York. He had already completed his studies at Yale in law. 2 years before boarding the Titanic, he'd taken the bar exam. But you see, just like Williams, he also loved tennis a little too much. He'd already become famous in the tennis world for representing the United States in the 1907 Davis Cup final. But unfortunately, he lost in the doubles final at Wimbledon that same year. But Bear was boarding the Titanic for a more personal reason than Williams. He'd fallen in love with his sister's friend, Helen Newsom, and was planning to marry her. But it wasn't that easy. Her family wasn't in favor of their relationship at all. Helen was from Ohio, and her parents had decided to take her on a grand European trip to separate the couple. But as soon as Carl found out, he rearranged his business schedule and joined Helen. After the European adventure was over, all of them were going to return to America together on the unsinkable ship. Bear was a first-class passenger and was given the cabin C-148. and Williams and his father were first-class passengers in the shelter deck. The tickets they bought for each suite cost £30 and to put that into perspective, that equals $4,060 today. A few days after setting off, tragedy struck when the Titanic hit the iceberg. As the situation became clear, panic set in, and people were hastily instructed to get into the lifeboats. Carl Bear wasn't going to leave the side of his love, Miss Newsom, so he went with her and her parents to lifeboat number 5. Now, there was this priority boarding rule back then, that women and children had to go into the boats first. The last lifeboats, if there were any, would be filled with men. Bear and his companions met Bruce Ismay on the deck, who was the managing director of the White Star Line that owned the Titanic. As soon as he saw them, he advised everyone to get into a lifeboat. This way Bear, who seemed like a muscular guy, could row the boat away with the rest of the gentlemen. Unfortunately, Williams had a more difficult evening. He and his father tried to guide as many passengers as they could into the lifeboats. Since most of them weren't leveled, they had to stand on the edge and help the survivors in. As they lowered the last one into the ocean, they made their way to the captain's bridge. At one point, they stood on the deck and glanced at the small lights in the lifeboats gliding in the distance. They were trying to figure out what to do, but the ship was beginning to sink and one of the giant funnels came off, hurtling towards Williams and his father. Desperately leaping out of the way, Williams plunged into the icy cold water. The funnel hit the water nearby, pushing him out further. He eventually found himself clinging onto one of the lifeboats that had been flipped upside down. It was collapsible A. At some point, Williams managed to climb onto the boat and stand on it. He was wearing a thick fur coat and shoes that he removed as soon as he got out of the water. After being in the freezing cold water for a few hours, he and a few other passengers were finally taken into Lifeboat 14. Because they'd been submerged under the freezing water from the waist down for so long, all of the survivors from the collapsible needed medical care immediately. When the Carpathia ship arrived, Williams was taken on board. When the doctor looked at his legs, he was shocked. Williams was feeling sharp pains right below his knees, and his legs were a dark purple color. The doctor told him he'd need to have his legs amputated to save his life, but Williams refused. Coincidentally, Carl Bear was on board as well. Luckily, he was okay. He was helping the other survivors. That was when the two tennis legends finally met. Williams said that Bear had shown him great kindness. He felt more encouraged, so he began taking his first steps on the Carpathia deck. He didn't want his tennis career to be cut short, so he fought through the pain, got up every 2 hours, and walked around to get some circulation going in his legs. As time progressed, so did Williams' health condition. After they arrived in New York, he took some time off to recover completely. 6 weeks later, he was back playing tennis. When the tournaments ended, he finally entered Harvard, and his tennis career thrived. From 1914 to 1916, he became the United States singles champion in tennis. In 1920, he became Wimbledon's doubles champion alongside Mr. Garland. And in 1924, he became an Olympic gold medalist in mixed doubles, managing to achieve it even with a sprained ankle. He had become so well known throughout the years, the media started writing articles about his athletic achievements all over the world. The first time Bear and Williams would face each other in a match was in 1912, not long after their shared tragedy on the sinking ship. Bear was the champion of that game, and it was Williams' first defeat in America. After that match, he kept training, and 2 years later at the rematch, Williams would turn things around to become the champion. After he defeated Bear in the quarterfinals, Williams went on to take his title for the first time ever. He became one of the best tennis players of his time, winning the Davis Cup 5 times, the Wimbledon doubles, and the U.S. Nationals twice. Both of these legends were given a place in the International Tennis Hall of Fame. While tennis was a huge part of both men's lives, it wasn't the only success they found. After their sports careers were over, they both became remarkable financiers. Bear gave up on his career as a lawyer and became interested in banking. At one point, he became the director of an interchemical company. Interestingly, Williams also followed a similar path. He became an investment banker and was the president of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Many years after the incident, 2 books came out sharing the 2 men's stories on the Titanic. Nobody knew about their encounters or their friendship. The similarities between them were uncanny. It's what you'd call 2 peas in a pod. Neither of them cared much about their achievements in the tennis field. They just enjoyed playing. But they also never talked about the time they spent on the Titanic. When the Titanic began its fateful voyage, it weighed about 52,000 tons. Now, how did they even get it into the water in the first place? Step 1. Find tons of soap and natural fat. Step 2. Dump it all over the ramp in front of the Titanic like a monster slip and slide. They even put grease all over the outside of the ship to make sure it didn't get scratched, dented, or even rip open. Just like that, the Titanic plopped softly into the water and the workers and owners breathed a sigh of relief. At least that part went well. When they built the Aswan Dam in Egypt, they needed to clear out a huge area for the new artificial lake. Almost 100,000 people had to move out of their homes. That was the easy part. Engineers now had to try to move 2 huge ancient Egyptian temples, or they'd be lost underwater forever. The answer? Thousands of engineers and builders. The temples were built into a mountain, so first they had to detach it using bulldozers and jackhammers. Then they had to take it all apart like a humongous Lego project. Statues, roofs, walls, sculptures, pretty sweet Lego set. Then they cut the temples into bite-sized bits, over 1,000 of them. Each one weighed the same as 3 elephants. So where did they put it all back together? On the same mountain, just 200 feet higher. It took 5 years and about $300 million in today's money. I think even the pharaohs would have been impressed. Now, say you're thirsty, so you grab a glass of water. But where does that water come from? In Saudi Arabia, it comes from salt water. You just need to get the salt out, no biggie. That calls for an evaporator. Saudi Arabia's machine brings fresh water to 300,000 people. Not bad for so much desert. The evaporator weighs 5,000 tons, and it's pretty big, like 10 basketball courts big. They hired a special ship to bring it from Vietnam to Saudi Arabia, but even that was too small. After making the ship a little bigger and making a successful cross-continent journey, the evaporator finally touched down in the Middle East. Then it was easy. Just grab 30 tractor-trailers and pull. Pretty impressive, but the largest thing ever moved on Earth is way bigger. Enter the Norwegian Troll gas production platform. It weighs more than the Titanic and is way taller than the Empire State Building. But the engineers weren't scared, even though they had to drag the thing 120 miles from shore. They hooked up 10 powerful boats and pulled it along for a week. That thing cost $1 billion to make, so they had to be careful. The boats were actually pulling it in all directions to keep it steady, then slowly making their way out to sea. Once it got there, its 4 powerful legs were secured with concrete, about as much as you'd use to build 200,000 houses. That part of the sea can be quite rough, so they had to make sure it wouldn't move at all. Natural gas can set on fire, even in the middle of the sea. You gotta move out of town, but you're used to your house, your big kitchen, cozy fireplace. No problem. Take your home with you. About 500 years ago, an Italian architect was constructing the local city's administration building, but the local church bell tower was getting in the way. The solution? Pick up the tower and move it. The architect built a wooden frame around the tower and shifted it using ropes, blocks, and a lot of people power. Since then, a lot of buildings have been moved around, but what happened in China changed everything. In 2004, engineers shifted the Fugang building about 120 feet. It was the heaviest building ever moved, but it only took 11 days. They worked day and night to get it done so fast. 10,000 years ago, a meteorite fell on Greenland. It was the only source of iron for the local people, who started breaking pieces off to make knives, harpoons, arrowheads, and even jewelry. Talk about good luck. Over time, the locals split the meteorite, named Cape York, into a bunch of pieces. Arctic explorer Robert Peary wanted to bring the biggest piece back to the U.S. So, how do you move 30 tons of space rock without trucks or paved roads? Plus, it's 1897 and freezing cold. It took 3 years, but he did it. He ended up building a railway with a special platform to pull it to the nearest shore. It was the first and last railway in Greenland. Peary sold the meteorite for $40,000. Today, that would be about $1 million. In 2012, artist Michael Heiser erected a 340-ton boulder over the entrance to the LA County Museum of Art. It was called Levitating Mass. Installing it was easy. Getting it there, not so much. They had to use a 290-foot trailer and 6 different trucks. They only drove at night 100 miles through 22 cities. The most insane part, it ended up costing $10 million. The Swedish ship Vasa, built about 400 years ago, was almost a celebrity. People were amazed by its size, beautiful decoration, and gold sculptures. First time out to sea, it sank. Why? A gust of wind. Oops. Anyway, about 80 years ago, they decided to pull it out. One plan was to fill it with ping pong balls and freeze it in a block of ice. But instead, they just tied some ropes around it and used 18 lifts to drag it along the seabed to a shallow area. From there, it was pretty easy to lift it out. It was mostly made of wood, not much metal. The ship survived quite well because of the cold seawater and even floated by itself. The shuttle Endeavour flew 25 missions into space, and in 2012, NASA decided it deserved a break. Its retirement home would be the California Science Center. The massive shuttle was loaded onto trailers and driven through LA at the amazing speed of 2 miles per hour. It was the first and probably last time that a spaceship would drive through a big city. They had to clear a pretty big path and ended up chopping down a lot of pesky things like lampposts, traffic lights, power lines, even over 400 trees. But don't worry, they raised a lot of money from the whole thing, enough to plant over 800 new trees. The Statue of Liberty wasn't built in the USA. It was built in France. After 9 years of hard work and a serious amount of copper and iron, she was ready to be given to the United States as a token of friendship. Sending it by mail would take way too much bubble wrap, so they decided to ship it instead. The statue was cut into 350 pieces, loaded into crates, and shipped over to New York. It took them 4 months to assemble all the pieces back together. Talk about Humpty Dumpty. Meet Bagger 288, a self-propelled excavator and the largest land transport on the planet. This beast can shift thousands of cars worth of dirt a day. It finished work in one quarry and had to move on to another. Taking it apart, shipping it, and putting it back together would have been ridiculous. So it just drove over there. It took 3 weeks and only moved at half a mile per hour. To stop it from wrecking everything it drove over, engineers walked ahead, planting grass and covering roads with gravel and dirt. Now, you're walking down the street in France, see a couple of cafes, maybe a nice bakery, and the world's largest gas turbine, named Harriet. Harriet's job? Keep the lights on in over 700,000 French homes. This mammoth turbine weighs as much as 2 jumbo jets and had to travel through France, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Hey, let's go Dutch! The Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt is made up of more than 2 million huge blocks of stone. No trailers, no tractors, just some good old-fashioned muscle power. Each block weighs more than 2.5 tons. That's like 30 of me. These guys didn't even have strong metals like iron or steel. They mostly used pieces of wood and stone hammers. May 31st, 1911. The second Olympic-class liner is finally complete after 2 years of construction. It'll be ready for its first voyage a year later. It's the most luxurious ship in the world. They call it Titanic. You just read the groundbreaking news in the Daily Herald and decide to treat yourself to a trip on this floating gem. You head over to the White Star Line's headquarters in London to buy yourself a ticket. You get the cheapest first-class fare for £30. That would be over $4,500 today. Wednesday, April 10, 1912. The day is finally here. You must be in Southampton at 9:30 a.m. The third-class passengers board the ship first. Then the second and first classes follow an hour before the vessel sets sail. Stewards on board welcome everyone and show them to their cabins. Now it's your turn. The majestic ship in front of you is bigger than you imagined. As you board the Titanic, Captain Edward Smith himself greets you. Your trip will begin shortly. By the time the liner stops at Cherbourg in Queenstown, over 2,200 passengers and crew will be on board, embarking on their transatlantic trip. The Titanic is ready to sail, and you hear the horns from the deck as you wave goodbye to the people below. But just a few minutes later, you hear panic rising on the deck. You run up to the railings to see what's going on. It's another ship coming too close. The side of it says SS City of New York. Titanic has barely left the dock, but it looks like there's about to be a collision. The captain manages to steer clear of the other ship within just a few feet. Phew, that was close. The ship is scheduled to arrive in New York a week later on April 17th, but that's only if things go according to plan. The weather is clear until Sunday the 14th. As the vessel crosses a cold front, it encounters huge waves and strong winds. That night is quiet but cold. The Titanic starts getting warnings from other ships about drifting blocks of ice in the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. But this time, the great ship doesn't continue to travel at full speed. Instead, the captain slows her down. He wants to make sure the lookouts will have plenty of time to spot any icebergs along the way, even if it means arriving in New York behind schedule. It's 11:40 in the evening. Lookout Frederick Fleet spots a colossal iceberg right ahead. He immediately alerts the bridge. The first officer tells the steersman to go around the iceberg, and the rest of the crew members must stop the engines right away. Everyone on board is working together to avoid the obstacle. But in this story, the steersman doesn't panic. He immediately turns the wheel the right direction away from the iceberg. Many passengers have already been awoken by the commotion and jostling. Some go on the deck in their nightgowns and pajamas to see what's going on. A few peek over the right side of the ship to get a closer look. You and everyone else watch anxiously with white-knuckle grips on the railing. The stress and cold make you shiver. You can't help but wonder if the Titanic will collide with the iceberg. It's getting closer and closer. Onlookers hold their breath. It's so quiet you could hear a pin drop. And then, within a mere inch, the ship slowly sails by the ice monster. There was no contact, no gap ripped in the hull hundreds of feet long that would allow water to flood into the lower compartments. Everyone starts clapping and hugging each other. After doing all the necessary checks, the captain officially announces that everything is all right. He invites the passengers on the deck to come inside for a hot cup of tea before they go back to their cabins. You follow the group and see the captain leaving to go report the incident. He also alerts other ships in the North Atlantic to slow down and be on the lookout. Amongst those ships is the Carpathia. Nope, she continues on her course. No need to come to Titanic's rescue tonight. RMS Titanic finally reaches its destination on April 17, 1912. It's 8 hours late, but it's safe. Thousands of people come to the New York docks to admire the most luxurious ship in the world. It had a successful first voyage. Before getting off the ship, some passengers exchange addresses to write letters to each other. Like tennis players Richard Norris and Carl Baer. Both were on board the Titanic, but this time, Norris didn't spend hours in the cold water of the North Atlantic trying to help other passengers, almost losing his legs to hypothermia. And Baer was never on a lifeboat with his girlfriend, where he asked her to marry him. No, this time, he did it with friends and family around, and they all celebrated the engagement. The two tennis players end up playing their first match together later in 1912. Norris became one of the best players of his generation and won the Davis Cup 5 times. Margaret Brown was going back to the U.S. to see her sick grandchild. This time, she didn't have to help passengers get on lifeboats and never got on Lifeboat 6 herself. When Brown gets off the ship, she runs to her grandson's side. This time, she never met the crew or the captain of the Carpathia to give them an honorary silver cup. She kept doing philanthropic work, but she never became known as the unsinkable Molly Brown. Violet Jessup never liked the idea of sailing in the North Atlantic because she knew how bad the weather could be. She was cautious, having just survived a crash a few months earlier. It was on the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic. But her friends convinced her to join the legendary ship's crew. This time, she was never called on deck to help passengers and never boarded Lifeboat 16. She continued working on the Titanic until her retirement, meaning she was never taken on as a nurse of the Britannic, and in November 1915, it didn't become the third shipwreck Jessup would survive. Bandmaster Wallace Hartley went on the voyage to make new possible contacts for future work, but he kept playing to entertain passengers. This time, he never played music to a panicked crowd of people while the ship was sinking. He survives. He goes home to his fiancée, gets married, and starts a family. He continues entertaining people on the North Atlantic run. This time, his mourning fiancée never received his violin, and the historic Titanic memorabilia was never sold in 2013 for $1.7 million. Bertha Main met the love of her life, Quig Baxter, in Brussels while he was traveling with his mother and sister. Baxter wanted to take Main with him, so he secretly booked her a cabin under the name Mrs. de Villiers. This time, he never had to guide his family to a lifeboat. His family met his girlfriend when they got off the ship, not on Lifeboat 6. This time, Baxter survived. He returned to Canada with his girlfriend, and she never went back to Europe alone. Main's nephew would never find a shoebox in her closet with memories from the Titanic. Dorothy Gibson was playing bridge that night with a couple of New York bankers. When she went back to her stateroom with her mother, she never heard that long, sickening crunch and never got on Lifeboat 7. And in May 1912, she doesn't star in a movie about surviving the Titanic because there was no crash to survive. She went on to do great things, and she eventually moved to France with her mom. In this hypothetical story, the Titanic went on to have a successful career. It was the most luxurious ship for many years to come. It did the North Atlantic run countless times, and it successfully delivered passengers and mail where they needed to go. After 25 years in service, the old liner was scrapped. Another large vessel replaced it. It had more room for lifeboats and a large enough deck for people to walk and play. The White Star Line Company would eventually merge with their competitors. But this time, because their ships didn't sink, they made enough profit to continue going strong. In 1980, the company would become a major airline. Their first trip was from Dublin to New York. The plane was nicknamed Titanic in honor of the airline's historic ship. And this time, in 1985, the only thing oceanographers find at the bottom of the North Atlantic is corals, fish, and mollusks. And a rather large blue diamond necklace. Hold on. Nah, just some broken blue glass. Never mind. April 12th, in the year 2212. It's a great date for humanity. The 300th anniversary of the launch of the legendary Titanic. The best engineers of the world have collaborated for years to bring their masterpiece to the public, the Space-Tanic, and they've done it just in time. The glorious spaceship is waiting in its harbor under the limelight, photographed by thousands of people. The trip was scheduled for April 12th, just like 300 years ago. Finally, the big day has come. The passengers are going on board the most magnificent spaceship of the time. They call it Unbreachable. It has 12 decks, from the third class closer to the bottom to the most luxurious first class on the top, with panoramic views of outer space. The ship is preparing for launch. The engines are starting, the final countdown has begun, and the Space-Tanic is off into the sky. It quickly becomes no more than a speck in the big blue and then disappears. The first day of the flight goes perfectly. The ship leaves the Earth's atmosphere in less than an hour, and passengers enjoy the wonderful view outside. The blue and green planet on the backdrop of the black void of space. The ship slows down a bit as it moves into orbit. There are too many satellites and space debris circling around the Earth. The Space-Tanic has to go carefully and maneuver around the chunks of metal floating in zero-G. One of them heads straight towards the ship, but it turns on the side burners and moves out of the way just in time. The scrap floats by safely. Finally, the ship is out of the danger zone and into the big black. It turns on the back thrusters to accelerate and heads to the bright side of the moon. It's going to be the first destination of the sightseeing tour. The planet becomes gradually smaller behind, and about halfway to the natural satellite, people on board can marvel at the sight of the sun. The huge ball of burning plasma is bigger and brighter than ever in the cosmic darkness. Suddenly, the ship's captain makes an announcement. All passengers are invited to the promenade decks to watch as the solar panels are being unfolded. People go outside to goggle at the sight. The silver and black panels slowly emerge from their containment slots, and the Space-Tanic finally takes its real form. As the sun's energy begins to flow into the ship, the thrust engines turn to minimum. The spaceship is now in energy collecting mode. For the trip to Mars to take just a few days, it needs to make a transit jump. In another 5 hours, another announcement rings across the board. The ship is approaching the moon, and the passengers are invited to look at the satellite from up close. The Space-Tanic passes by at several thousand miles, and the moon looks huge. All the craters on the satellite, even the smallest ones, are clearly visible. The view is outstanding. The moon is left behind, and lights on the ship go dim. There's no natural change of day and night in space, so the crew monitors the time and imitates the shift. The next day promises nothing of interest, as there's going to be a long traverse between the moon and Mars. The passengers are wandering off to their cabins to sleep. The next 2 days go uneventful. On the decks, there are numerous types of entertainment for guests. From gyms and swimming pools to game rooms and dancing halls. People wander around the promenade decks, enjoying the serene views of space. Nothing bodes trouble. On the 4th day, the captain finally announces that the Space-Tanic is preparing for the transit jump in 30 minutes. When the time comes, the passengers only feel a slight tug as the huge vessel leaps through space-time, entering the vicinity of Mars. Many passengers go outside to look at the red planet, which is already visible in the dark abyss. The tour is entering its final stage, but the landing is only planned for late night. At 11 p.m., when most passengers were already in their beds, the Space-Tanic begins the final maneuvers. It has to make a little roundabout trip over Mars because the port is on the other side of the planet. The flight is nearing its end, only a couple of hours left before landing. The ship is in the orbit on the far side of Mars. Everything's quiet. Too quiet. All of a sudden, an enormous boom thrashes the whole Space-Tanic, throwing sleeping people out of their beds. Blinking emergency lights turn on. Everyone's confused, but no announcement comes from the captain. And only those who have been on the starboard side promenade deck notice the horrible detail. The right front wing has been torn off and is zooming past them towards the stern. Pressing their faces to the glass, straining to look at the hull, they see a huge gash near the nose of the ship. The Space-Tanic shudders again, and chunks of metal fly out of the gaping hole. the ship rapidly loses pressurization. Meanwhile, the broken-off wing hit the stern and left another gash in it. Mechanisms in the engine compartment start to fall apart and are dragged into space. The ship groans and comes to a halt, suspended thousands of miles above Mars. At last, the captain announces through the intercom that the Titanic has unexpectedly collided with a rogue asteroid. All passengers are asked to proceed to their respective decks for evacuation. Within an hour, all rescue capsules are occupied and ready to be deployed. But about a third of the passengers are still on board the ship. It turns out many of the capsules were blown away at the collision. History seems to repeat itself. The captain still orders to deploy the capsules, and they whoosh out of containment tanks, leaving hundreds of people behind. Some left without their family members, not knowing what fate awaits them. The capsules float in space for a few seconds and then turn on their thrust engines, heading to the Martian surface. Another order from the captain: everyone is to go down to their cabins and put on pressurized suits stored under their beds. As the passengers rush to comply, the Titanic sends distress signals to Mars and everyone in the vicinity. 100,000 miles away, a large trade ship, Leona, picks up the signal and hurries to help. The creaks and groans on board the Titanic become more and more frantic. People are sitting silently in their cabins. It's quiet on board, except for the sounds of the slowly disintegrating ship. And then, suddenly, a loud snap resonates throughout the Titanic, and the vessel cracks in two. A gigantic fracture goes from top to bottom, almost perfectly halfway across the decks. Pressurized glass covering the promenade decks shatter into millions of pieces, slowly flying away from the ship. With the decks depressurized, people and things are blown away into outer space. Thankfully, all of the passengers and crew are wearing their suits as ordered, but they only have about an hour before they run out of oxygen. People help each other by floating together and hauling stranded ones to their groups. They can barely control their floating, but somehow they still manage to bring some order to the chaos. Huddled together in orbit above the ominously red planet, they watch as the mighty Titanic turns into a heaping pile of space debris. 45 minutes have passed. The oxygen is running low, and people try to breathe as slowly and carefully as they can. There's still no help in sight, and they're preparing for the worst. But then, one of them starts waving and pointing somewhere. It's a bright spot, hardly different from the stars in far space, but it's getting closer by the second. And within 5 minutes, the relieved people see a spaceship speeding towards them. The Leonas arrive just in time to save the day. Quickly, but without hurry, Leona's crew gather everyone floating in space around the remains of the Titanic and haul them on board their ship. In a few hours, the Leona safely lands at Mars' main spaceport. The newspapers called it the day when the Titanic sank again. It was just a couple of hours before midnight. Some of the 2,200 passengers of a large, luxurious ocean liner were still partying in the beautiful first-class lounges. The rest were asleep in their beds, some of them in spacious cabins filled with paintings and decorated with ornate carvings, others in tiny rooms below sea level. All of these people had only one thing in common. On that chilly April night, all of them were heading from Southampton in England to New York City. The ship was called the Titanic, and at that time, it was considered unsinkable. At the very beginning of the journey, the liner nearly collided with the steamship New York. Luckily, the Titanic managed to pass by the other vessel with several feet to spare. A common sigh of relief escaped the passengers crowding the liner's decks. Little did they know what was awaiting them in the near future. Several days later, when the ship was already in the North Atlantic Ocean, 370 miles away from Newfoundland, the unthinkable happened. At about 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, those who were still awake were knocked over by some mysterious and powerful force. Passengers who were already in their beds got catapulted to the floor. Screams and total confusion. Months before the disaster struck, a ginormous chunk of ice had broken away from a glacier in southwest Greenland. It was made of the snow that had fallen about 100,000 years ago, when mammoths were still roaming the planet. When the iceberg just started its journey, it was a huge thing, almost 1,700 feet long. It also weighed 75 million tons. But then it floated much further to the south than normal, right into the area the Titanic had to cross on its way to North America. Even after melting into the water for months, the iceberg still weighed an impressive 1.5 million tons. Its top part was towering over the water for almost 100 feet. Even so, it looked harmless next to the massive ocean liner, but only at first glance. What people saw was just a tiny part of a jumbo piece of ice. The largest part of any iceberg is hidden under the surface, with a mere 1/10 visible above the water. The Titanic iceberg wasn't an exception. The moment the ship collided with it, the vessel was doomed. Unable to divert its course, it crashed into the ice, rupturing at least 5 of its hull compartments. They immediately started to fill with water, which then flooded each succeeding compartment. The front of the ship started to sink. This raised the back part almost vertically into the air, and then, with a deafening roar, the liner broke in half. The rest is history. But what if what we know about the disaster is not true? What if the ship hadn't been wrecked by an iceberg? What if it had been something more treacherous and way more alive that sank the Titanic? Far, far beneath the surface, in the ocean's dim, dark depths, a shadow lurks. Imagine an enormous creature, round, flat, and full of arms, or rather, powerful tentacles. It resembles a giant squid or octopus, but much, much bigger. Its descriptions go from as long as 10 ships to 1.5 miles long. Rumor has it unlucky sailors sometimes mistake the sea monster for an island, but instead of stepping on dry land, they're dragged down into the ocean. These people meet the Kraken, a legendary creature feared by everyone who sets off on a sea voyage. Usually, the Kraken haunts the seas off the coast of Norway through Iceland and all the way to Greenland. Who knows what has brought the beast further away from home? The waters of the North Atlantic are just as chilly, and the creature feels good and curious. Once it notices the Titanic, the ship has no chances to escape its attention. It's dark. That's why those on the ocean liner don't notice the first alarm bells. The water around the ship starts to bubble. If you strain your ears, you can hear bizarre gurgling sounds. If you strain your eyes, you can see thousands of fish and jellyfish rising to the surface. They feel something's up down below. But even if someone on the Titanic noticed this hectic activity, they wouldn't have time to get out of the way of the horrifying beast. Its enormous size and super long and strong tentacles turn it into a predator you can't escape. A 9-year-old boy standing on the deck knows nothing about the sea monster. He's just watching countless small islands rising out of the sea, very, very slowly. The kid doesn't understand why, but all the blood in his body suddenly runs cold. Hundreds of tiny fish are leaping about in the pools between these sandbanks. But soon, they roll off into the water over the sides of the ginormous something. Several sharp points appear above the surface. The intrigued boy thinks they look like horns. They keep growing, thicker and thicker, the higher they rise. Soon they're towering over the massive Titanic, dwarfing the ship. These horns are the Kraken's dreaded arms. The boy is paralyzed by fear, but then he spots the monster's eye. It's as big as an elephant. It makes the kid come to his senses and dash away, screaming like there's no tomorrow. The boy's shouting attracts people. They gather along the ship's side, trying to spot what scared the child so much. And then they see. First one, then more and more passengers and crew members lean over the railing to get a better look. They aren't being careless, they're just in shock. Indeed, it's hard to believe your eyes when they tell you a dreaded beast is about to attack the ship you're on. Plus, it's dark, and no one can see clearly what that huge shadow is. But the next several minutes prove it's not a mirage. All of a sudden, the creature rises one of its monstrous arms and stretches it toward the vessel. It might very well be longer than the liner's entire hull. Women start screaming and fainting. Men seem to be just as terrified. Those who have managed to keep their heads clear sweep up kids and run for shelter. That's when the first powerful hit shakes the vessel. The Kraken's had enough waiting. It's ready for action. Panic engulfs people on board the Titanic. Running around aimlessly and screaming, they create chaos that makes the beast even more interested. Normally, the monster just wants to be left alone. It rests deep down on the ocean floor, using its long tentacles to tether itself to the bottom and lazily hunt for food. It only rises to the surface when the weather's unusually warm, or when it gets disturbed. The Titanic is probably too massive and loud. It draws the creature out of its slumber. When the beast gets to the surface and sees a large, glistening boat, wow, the thing mesmerizes the creature. It holds out one of its tentacles to touch the unusual construction. The material is hard, and the beast wonders if the thing will break when squeezed. Without wasting much time, it wraps several arms around the ship and tries to squish it. Tiny creatures fussing around, falling overboard, and making annoying high-pitched noises start to irritate the Kraken. It's getting angry. Easing its grip, the monster circles the Titanic several times, getting ready for the next attack. This time, the strike is much stronger. It bends the metal and makes it brittle. One more movement of a deft tentacle, and the ship starts to fill with water. The Kraken retreats, as if to enjoy the results of its efforts. But then, it notices the ship trying to speed up in futile attempts to put some distance between itself and the monster. People on board the Titanic heave a sigh of relief. The beast is nowhere in sight. Little do they know that the Kraken never lets its toys get away. The ship is beginning to slow down. Its rear part is slowly lifting up, and the front is going down underwater. Passengers and crew members are falling over onto the decks. Most of them are too scared to make a sound. That's why everything's happening in almost complete eerie silence. Until the ship breaks into two parts under its own weight. The crash is so powerful that it scares away even the Kraken. Spooked, the beast dives back into the ocean, which creates a massive boiling whirlpool in that spot. The suction is dragging what's left of the Titanic to the depths of the ocean. The most tragic thing here, though, the Kraken isn't even interested in people on board the ship. This creature is content to munch on fish. It doesn't need bigger prey. It's the animal's curiosity that's now pulling the huge ship down to the bottom. Does the majestic liner have any hope? I think you know the answer.
The lookout shouts, "Iceberg right ahead!" The Titanic strikes the ice. Water starts flooding in. Third-class passengers are locked up. There aren't enough lifeboats for everyone. Panic sets in. Violins are playing. The ship sinks. Well, we all know the story of the movie Titanic like the back of our hand by now. But what if I told you that Hollywood lied to us? To tell the real story of what happened that freezing night in 1912, we need to rewind a bit. The lookout shouts, "Iceberg right ahead!" Yep, that part was true. Just before 11:40 at night, Frederick Fleet noticed something darker than the sea directly ahead. As the ship got closer, he realized it was an iceberg. The engines were quickly reversed and the ship turned sharply. Instead of hitting it head-on, Titanic scraped along the side of the berg, sprinkling ice on the forward deck. If you remember, in the movie, Jack and Rose are having a romantic moment when they feel the ship shudder after hitting the iceberg. Everything shakes as if they were in the middle of a light earthquake. Some real-life passengers reported feeling something similar after the impact, but according to Titanic survivor Frank Prentice, it wasn't exactly like that. He said there was no impact as such, and it all felt more like slamming on your car brakes. The ship stopped, and that was that. Some people even slept right through the collision, confirming that there wasn't such an abrupt impact. Mr. Prentice, curious about what had happened, left his cabin and went out to the deck. When he got there, all he could see was a little ice on the surface. not the towering iceberg that Jack and Rose saw. But as we all know by now, the real damage happened below the waterline, where the iceberg had a jagged spur that slashed a 300-foot gash in Titanic's hull. Once the crew realized how severe the damage was, they immediately began sending distress calls to nearby ships, asking for help. At some point in the movie, the radio operator goes to the captain and says there is only one ship nearby, the RMS Carpathia, which later ends up rescuing many passengers. But in real life, there were more ships around. It's believed that the SS Californian was only about 23 miles away. This ship might have actually seen the Titanic sinking, or at the very least, seen its rockets exploding high in the sky. Yet, for reasons we will never fully understand, they didn't try to help. Let's get back to the story. Now, people need to get off the ship. At 12:45, lifeboat number 7 was the first to be lowered. Just like in the movie, women and children were told to go first. But in reality, some women were hesitant and even refused to get into the lifeboats. Mr. Prentice said this happened mainly for 2 reasons. First, these lifeboats were high and passengers were terrified of the 70-foot drop from the deck to the ocean below. And second, most women didn't believe the Titanic would actually sink. It was called unsinkable after all. So the idea of getting into a lifeboat seemed pointless at the time. This mindset probably explains why Eloise Smith, a first-class passenger, recalled that there was no panic or chaos at first. Other survivors backed this up, saying that no women or kids were crying. But one thing that was indeed concerning, at least for the crew, was the possibility that the lifeboats might buckle under too much weight. This is one of the theories why the first few lifeboats left carrying only a fraction of their full capacity. Like lifeboat number 7, which only carried 27 people in it, even though it could hold up to 65. In total, Titanic had 20 lifeboats, which could carry about half of the 2,200 people on board that night. But that didn't happen. And now we know the passengers had no idea there weren't enough for everyone. As women were calmly getting into the first lifeboats, musicians headed up to the deck. Their only goal was to play and keep the passengers calm. That's a pretty well-known fact. But the real story is that some survivors said they never saw or heard the band. No violinists whatsoever. It's not like Hollywood misled you though. The musicians did play for over 2 hours after the ship had hit the iceberg. So maybe these passengers were just too panicked to notice the songs, or the musicians started playing later than we think. Now, it's time to talk about the terrible treatment that third-class passengers received. The movie portrayed the crew as cruel, locking the less fortunate below deck like animals, giving them no chance to reach the lifeboats and save their lives. But the official inquiry into the disaster suggested that wasn't true. I mean, yes, fewer third-class passengers survived compared to those in first and second class, but there were other factors at play. Many third-class passengers were reluctant to leave the ship, clinging to their belongings, and had a harder time making their way up from the cabins, which were at extreme ends of the ship. Some survivors confirmed that they were not locked up. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Mrs. George Wabi, a Lebanese woman traveling in third class, said that when chaos had erupted, some brave crew members and well-dressed first-class passengers had actually helped her get up to the first-class deck and eventually onto a lifeboat. At first, the Titanic was sinking slowly, bit by bit. Passengers reported seeing the water rising and hearing pops and cracks. Then, there was a loud boom. Some said there had been just one explosion, while others described it as a series of smaller explosions, which they'd thought had been the bulkheads giving way. And there's also a group of people who said they had only heard a rumbling sound. So not everyone agreed on the sound they had heard, but one thing is a fact. By 2:18 in the morning, the lights on Titanic went out, and the ship plunged into complete darkness. As the bow continued sinking, the stern rose out of the water, putting immense pressure on the middle of the ship. This caused the Titanic to break in two. In James Cameron's movie, this moment is pretty dramatic, with the ship sinking almost straight down into the water. But in reality, the break probably happened at a much lower angle, likely just below the waterline. Even so, it tilted enough that people couldn't stay on their feet and started sliding into the water. One interesting thing is that it wasn't until the wreckage was found in 1985 that it was finally confirmed the Titanic had broken apart. Up until then, survivors had given conflicting stories. At least 8 survivors claimed they had seen the ship split. Emily Ryerson, a first-class passenger, described it as if the Titanic had been sliced in half with a knife. But there was also a small number of witnesses that insisted Titanic had gone down intact. At the time, this theory was more accepted because most people still didn't believe that the supposedly indestructible ship could break in half. So why the conflicting reports? Okay, so what you don't see in the movies, for obvious reasons, is how incredibly dark it was when the tragedy happened. It was like being in a room with no light, where you can only make out shapes and shadows. That's what it was like on the lifeboats. This means passengers couldn't really see what was happening, and most of those who were close to the ship either lost their lives or were too focused on trying to survive to pay attention to the details of the wreck. Although James Cameron's film didn't fully capture how terrifyingly dark the disaster truly was, the 2012 TV series Titanic did a better job of showing the pitch-black horror of that night. Even then, the reality was much darker and more terrifying than either of these two productions could portray.
The unsinkable Titanic didn't go down peacefully, which made finding its final resting place all the more difficult. The world-famous RMS Titanic sank in 1912, but was only discovered in 1985 on a secret mission. Although people back in the early 1900s had the approximate location of where the Titanic was, they didn't have the right technology to find it. As it went under, the ship sent several CQD signals, standing for Come Quickly, Distress, to a nearby ship named Carpathia. Come at once, we have struck a berg. It's a CQD, old man, were some of the final words transmitted from the Marconi wireless on the ship. These Morse code messages were also what made the first research missions to the wreck possible. RMS Carpathia found the lifeboats filled with Titanic survivors, but the world also desperately wanted to see what became of the famous liner. Fast forward to 1953. That's when the first serious attempt to find the Titanic wreck happened. A man named Risdon Beasley tried using a loud eruptive device to locate the ship. It sounds weird, but there's science to back it up. When dynamite goes off, the waves from the detonation hit the bottom of the ocean floor. With the help of sonars, scientists would be able to locate if there was anything solid at the bottom of the ocean. But Beasley had no luck. Another 20 years would pass before oceanographer Robert Ballard would make his attempt to locate the Titanic. Ballard had a bit more luck than Beasley. Over the previous years, underwater technology had gotten more funding and so worked much better. He tried it the first time in 1977. Ballard partnered with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution on a mission to map the ocean floor. While the institute hired him to test out their new mapping technology, Ballard's intention was to go a little further and find the Titanic wreck. In the middle of this new technological ship, there was a hole that allowed for a long pipe to be extended into the water just above the ocean floor. Attached to the end of this pipe, Ballard installed a pod with sonars and cameras. They thought they were in for something big, and so they took the ship to sea to run some tests. That's when, on a trial run, adversity struck. The drill pipe broke, sending all of their expensive material to the bottom of the ocean floor, just like the Titanic. When Ballard failed, another important character came into this story, a man named Jack Grimm, an eccentric oil tycoon. Grimm had become famous for trying to find things such as Noah's Ark, the Loch Ness Monster, and Bigfoot. He also tried to prove the hollow Earth theory, that says that the interior of Earth is entirely hollow and hosts underground cities and nations. His search consisted of trying to find a large hole on the North Pole and thus venturing inside the hollow Earth. After his attempts failed, he set his eyes on the jewel liner that had sunk, the RMS Titanic. Grimm had the money, but he didn't have the know-how. So, as a billionaire, he made a big donation to Columbia University and asked in return to use some of their equipment. He hired a team of highly qualified scientists to help operate the machinery. Here's where it gets a little strange. Jack Grimm was a believer in folklore and non-conventional ways of doing things. So he brought a monkey on board and surprised the research team. This monkey, called Titan, was believed to point to a map and locate lost things. In this case, the Titanic. The scientists went crazy when the monkey appeared and told Grimm it was either them or the monkey. This expedition left Florida without Titan. Yes, there would be no monkey business. They set the course to the exact location of Titanic's last distress signal. They arrived, examined every inch of the ocean floor, but still found nothing. Grimm's first expedition lasted 3 weeks, but unfortunately, they found absolutely nothing. They tried a particularly good search method known as mowing the lawn, where they mimic such movements to map every inch of a larger area around Titanic's distress coordinates. The reasons for failure were important defects in the equipment and terrible weather. That's when that prior searcher of the lost Titanic came back into the picture, Robert Ballard. He didn't have the millions Jack Grimm had, but he had one thing going for him. The marine geologist was working closely with the U.S. Navy to locate 2 nuclear submarines which had sunk in the 1960s. Ballard himself says he was living 2 lives, one as a researcher and the other as a Navy intelligence officer. The deal was simple. He'd have a green light to search for the Titanic after he found the 2 missing submarines. To find Thresher and Scorpion, he used an unmanned submarine vehicle called Argo. Argo was like a little snow sled. It was attached to a bigger ship that sailed above the water. Argo was connected to the ship by a long cable, and it was piloted by a team on board. The sled had sonars and cameras that provided real-time imaging of the ocean floor, so it was a real advancement on other attempts. After much thinking, he had a eureka moment. He supposed the force of the wreck should have left a comet trail that led back to the ship. While searching for the Titanic, most people had tried to find the ship itself. But until then, it had been trying to find a needle in a haystack. That's why Ballard's logic was so brilliant. He needed to invert the order. He had another obstacle on his hands: time. He could only look for the ship after finding the lost subs. And by the time that happened, he had 12 days left. He teamed up with another scientist, and they applied the mowing the lawn method to map the ocean bed. Another important piece of information that most researchers left out was that there was a sea current moving south on the day of the disaster. This meant that the debris field should be south of the distress signal coordinates. To save time and resources, he would do a quick reconnaissance of the ocean floor, spacing lines more than 3 miles apart to look for debris fields. He also relied more on the camera visuals than on the sonar signals. His team took turns piloting Argo and watching the video. Days rolled by, with nothing but the empty ocean floor showing up. Until the rocks they were used to seeing started to look like man-made debris. Suddenly, there it was, the Titanic's boiler. Ballard was right. The debris field would take them back to the ship. After 73 years of searching, they had finally found the Titanic wreck. It seems like we all cried watching the heartbreaking goodbye of Jack and Rose from the Titanic. Oops, spoiler, sorry. But the real-life stories from the sinking of the famous ship were no less touching. Joseph LaRoche was born in 1886 in Haiti to a wealthy family. He was growing up without a dad, but his mother was a self-made woman and a respected merchant. His uncle was the head of his country. Joseph was fluent in French, Creole, and English. At the age of 15, Joseph realized he wanted to become an engineer. There were no engineering schools in Haiti, so he moved to France to get his education. The journey took him a whopping 83 days. Still, in his student years, Joseph met Juliet in a suburb of Paris through a mentor. They soon became friends, and then it grew into something bigger. The couple decided to get married. There was only one problem. Joseph couldn't find a well-paid qualified job even after completing his studies because of racial discrimination. The intelligent young man realized he could do better. Plus, he needed to provide for his growing family. His third kid was on the way. His uncle back in Haiti promised he'd help Joseph secure a job as a mathematics professor. His mother was overjoyed that her son and his family would be living in Haiti. She bought them first-class tickets for the French liner La France as a reunion gift. But that liner had really weird rules separating parents from their offspring for meals. The LaRoches didn't want to leave their youngsters and make them feel sad on a trip across the ocean. So they decided to trade their first-class tickets for La France for second-class tickets for RMS Titanic's maiden voyage. The Titanic was all the hype, and it didn't separate families, so it looked like a great deal. They planned to change for another ship in New York that would take them straight to their final destination in Haiti. The family boarded the Titanic on April 10, 1912, at Cherbourg. They had 3 days to enjoy the luxurious staterooms, a dining salon, a library, and 3 outdoor promenade decks available to second-class passengers. Juliet sent a letter to her father from Titanic's final stop in Queenston, Ireland. She told him they were more than happy with the accommodation. They had 2 bunks in their cabin and a couch that converted into a bed for their youngest family members. The family made friends with some nice co-passengers with whom they had traveled together from Paris. She thought they had been the only other French people on board, so they sat together for meals. Juliet mentioned they had all spent time together on the deck of the liner. She also wrote the people on board were friendly, although some sources say the family had gone through quite a lot of mean stares, gossip, and remarks. On the night of April 14th, their exciting journey came to an abrupt end. Even though Titanic's wireless operators had received warnings about drifting ice from nearby ships, the liner continued to plow ahead at full throttle. It was around 11:40 p.m. when Titanic's hull collided with the iceberg around 370 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. The practically unsinkable ship was severely under-equipped with lifeboats, enough for only about half of its 2,200 passengers. The nearest rescue ship, the Carpathia, was too far away to help. A steward woke up the LaRoche family and took them to the lifeboats, as Juliet remembered later. She couldn't speak any English, so everything that was going on seemed even scarier to her. A little after midnight, the crew received the order to give priority to women and children when boarding the lifeboats. Juliet later remembered a terrible panic had begun, as people had been pushing each other to get to the desired seat. At some point, she felt they had pulled away her older daughter and thrown her into the abyss. A moment later, she had joined her Simone in the same emptiness. So, pregnant Juliet and her 2 daughters got spots in Lifeboat 14. But they had to say goodbye to Joseph as the boat was being lowered into the sea. He wrapped his coat around Juliet, saying she'd need it, and promised to get in another lifeboat and see her and the little ones again in New York. The 25-year-old Joseph LaRoche didn't manage to stay true to his word. In a couple of hours, Titanic sank underwater, taking the lives of almost 1,500 people. Joseph was one of them. Juliet and the girls were among the 700 survivors who had been rescued by the Cunard liner Carpathia several hours later. Once they reached New York, they were looking through the crowds of people, hoping to see Joseph again. When it became obvious they wouldn't find him, it was time for them to decide what to do and where to go. Without any knowledge of English or money that had gone down with the ship, Juliet managed to survive in America only for 3 weeks, and then had no other choice but to go back to France. Joseph's uncle was no longer able to help them, as others had taken his life 4 months after the Titanic tragedy. In December 1912, Juliet gave birth to a son who she named Joseph after his father. For the rest of her life, she couldn't get over the loss of her beloved husband. That's why she didn't like to speak about what had happened on Titanic and told her children not to mention it. In 1995, a member of the Titanic Historical Society interviewed Louise, who was the last remaining LaRoche child and the last French survivor of the sinking. And that's when the world first heard about this heartbreaking story. It inspired some plays and articles, but it never got the same attention as the story of other passengers. You probably remember the elderly couple going down together in their bed on the Titanic. It was inspired by Isidor and Ida Strauss. They were both born in Germany and emigrated to the United States as kids. They met in New York and got married 5 years later. Isidor started a china and porcelain business with his brother that grew into the glassware department at Macy's and turned them into multimillionaires. Isidor and Ida were well known in New York, not only for their wealth and charity, but also for their love and devotion to each other. In 1912, the couple decided to run away from the New York winters and headed for Europe. By that time, they'd already been married for 40 years. In early April, it was time for them to sail back home to New York. They normally traveled on huge German liners, but at that time, they couldn't resist the hype of everyone talking about that new luxury liner, the RMS Titanic. That's how they ended up in one of the first-class private suites at the top of the ship. The Strauss couple spent their evenings dining in front of a live orchestra in a hall filled with fancy furniture and expensive wooden paneling. On the night of April 14th, they felt a slight tremor and then left their private suite and waited for instructions from the crew. They told the passengers not to lose their passes, as they'd need them when everyone got back on board. But the ship was going under. The Strauss couple were standing next to Lifeboat 8. Mr. Strauss, who was 67 at the time, was offered a seat with his wife because of his age. He refused it, saying he was not too old to sacrifice himself for a woman. He wanted to wait and make sure no women and kids were left behind. Ellen Bird, Ida's maid, hesitated before getting on the lifeboat, but Ida told her to go. She took the easy decision not to leave her husband on the sinking ship. Ida took off her beautiful mink coat and handed it to her shivering maid, saying she wouldn't be needing it anymore. Isidor didn't manage to convince her to save herself, so they stayed together till the end. Some of the surviving first-class passengers later remembered they had seen the couple standing peacefully on the deck, holding hands, just waiting. It was 11:39 at night when the Titanic's lookout shouted, "Iceberg, right ahead!" Swift action on the bridge to reduce speed and change the ship's course didn't help, and you already know how the story ends. Since then, we've regarded what happened to Titanic as a once-in-a-lifetime event. Is it though? The Titanic sank in 1912. Forget about fancy GPSs or weather satellites. At the time, ships were responsible for warning each other about the location of icebergs, like a "hey man, trust me on this" situation. Then the Titanic disaster happened. To call it a disaster is an understatement, so specialists felt the need to form an organization to avoid this kind of accident happening again. That's why, a year later, they created the International Ice Patrol, or IIP for short. Up to this day, this group has been responsible for giving ships advanced warnings about ice threats. IIP improved their methods over the years, from ship reports and aircraft patrols to satellite images. Recently, they've also been using oceanographic buoys, floating devices providing real-time information about ocean conditions up to 164 feet below the surface to predict the potential drift of icebergs. Luckily, IIP is doing an excellent job in reducing ship iceberg collisions. But don't get too comfortable, because even the most advanced detection equipment can't entirely avoid an unfortunate situation. Between 1980 and 2005, there were 57 incidents involving vessels and icebergs. And the chilling truth is that today's ships are more likely to run into an iceberg than the Titanic was. Studies have shown that 1,038 icebergs crossed the area where the Titanic sank back in 1912. You might think that's a lot, but scientists say it's not really a big deal. I mean, yeah, it's on the higher side, but there have been 14 years with even more iceberg activity since then. Nowadays, the number of icebergs is going up due to the accelerated melting of Greenland's glaciers. And since more ships are heading into polar waters, the chances of ships bumping into icebergs are higher. But the real danger for captains is invisible enemies, called growlers and bergy bits. Growlers are these small icebergs that can be the size of a regular door. And bergy bits are also considered small, measuring around the size of a school bus. These icebergs might seem harmless, but they're actually tricky since they can be completely invisible to radars or satellites. Let's see what happens when a modern cruise ship as big as the Titanic hits one of these small icebergs. Meet the Norwegian Sun, a luxurious cruise ship like Titanic, as it has the capacity to accommodate 2,400 passengers and more than 900 crew members. On July 2022, this cruise ship was on its way to Hubbard Glacier in Alaska when it found itself in the middle of a dense fog. Suddenly, passengers felt an impact and were terrified as the ship experienced a severe jolt. The fog immediately cleared and they realized what had happened. The Norwegian Sun had collided with an iceberg of the growler type. But the outcome was entirely different from Titanic. Thankfully, there were no injuries, and both the passengers and staff reached the Alaskan docks safely. Expert divers checked the condition of the boat, and they discovered that the ship had suffered some damage after the collision, so the rest of the trip was canceled. Now don't stress about packing for your next trip across the Atlantic, because accidents like the one with the Norwegian Sun are really rare. I mean, it's common for ships to encounter ice, but what's unusual is for it to be a problem. Most modern cruise ships wouldn't get physically damaged by an iceberg, and there's a reason for that. You see, the steel used in the Titanic also played a significant role in the disaster. The unsinkable ship, after all, was not so impact-resistant. Back then, the Titanic's hull was constructed using around 2,000 steel plates, which are believed to have been produced in an open hearth furnace. As a result, the steel contained a high concentration of phosphorus, oxygen, and sulfur. High levels of these elements make steel brittle at low temperatures, causing it to fail upon impact. While the steel used on the Titanic was of the highest quality available at the time, it wouldn't meet the safety standards of modern ships, and it was approximately 10 times less safe than what today's vessels use. But the most significant difference between the design of the Titanic and a modern ship lies in how the hull is put together. You see, the Titanic was built using over 3 million rivets for its hull and upper deck structure. So, when it struck the iceberg, the rivets started a chain reaction, causing the entire section of the hull to collapse simultaneously, causing an uncontrollable flood of water. In contrast, modern ships use a method called submerged arc welding, which fuses the edges of metal pieces together, creating a strong and continuous bond. This is safer because if any part of the ship gets damaged, the tear doesn't spread, making things worse. The damage remains contained within that section. Okay, so small icebergs are becoming more common, and vessels have been adapted to deal with them. But there's still one more scenario to consider. What if a huge cruise ship hit an iceberg the size of a 5-story building? Imagine we've just created the world's largest cruise ship on the planet. Let's call it the Bright Seaside. Our floating resort is massive, 4 times the size of the Statue of Liberty. It's longer than the Titanic by 318 feet and carries about 3 times more passengers and crew. And just like the Titanic, our fictional ship can cruise at a top speed of around 23 knots. Now, picture this scenario. The Bright Seaside is cruising at full speed in freezing waters. It's the middle of the night, and the captain doesn't realize that all the iceberg detecting equipment on board isn't functioning. It stopped working 3 days ago. It's very foggy out there, and the lookout also fails to spot a 45-foot tall iceberg. If that whole situation played out, and the ship smacked into the iceberg head-on, well, it could potentially lead to a sinking. But you can see how unlikely that is, right? That's why experts are quite confident in saying that ice isn't likely to sink modern cruise ships. It's also worth mentioning that safety measures have improved a lot since Titanic. A modern large vessel can take days to sink, which provides enough time to keep everyone safe. Crews are definitely better prepared to handle evacuation procedures, and passengers should also go through safety training before cruising. I know, it is annoying to do that when all you want to do is drink a lemonade or some other beverage by the pool. But, all these safety tips are what saved the MS Explorer from becoming a modern Titanic. You see, back in 2007, all 154 people on board this Antarctic cruise ship managed to get into lifeboats after the ship hit an iceberg. Now imagine their panic as they waited for help for 4 hours. The crew did an excellent job in keeping everybody safe, no doubt. But a report that came out 2 years later said that the MS Explorer accident had happened because of the inexperience of the captain, who had pushed the ship too fast into a wall of ice in the freezing waters of Antarctica. That means that no matter how much tech a ship's got or how fancy its materials are, if you've got a careless captain and a crew that doesn't know how to handle an iceberg hit, yep, a disaster similar to Titanic could happen again. But hey, you shouldn't stress over it. Trust the professionals and keep in mind the odds. In the last 30 years, the MS Explorer was the only cruise ship that sank thanks to an iceberg, and everyone survived. So kick back and enjoy your sea vacation.
If I asked you to name the most famous shipwreck of all time, you'd go with the Titanic, right? The Atlantic Ocean, the hope for new life, heartbreaking love stories. It had it all to become a blockbuster. But I guess you've never heard of SS Princess Alice that submerged in the sewage of the River Thames, taking between 600 and 700 lives with it. Life in 19th century Victorian London wasn't easy, especially for working class folks. Affordable public transport and bank holidays made it a bit easier. The people could escape to the coast on a train or pleasure boat, even if it was just for a day. Sheerness on the Isle of Sheppey in Kent started as a fort under Henry VIII and then grew into a bustling town with a dockyard. When they added a railway station in 1863, it became a prime destination for day trippers and holidaymakers. Seaside promenades, charming piers, and a whole bunch of fun stuff to do by the sea. It had it all. A bit inland along the River Thames, you had the Rocherville Gardens. These gardens had archery lawns, bowls, mazes, lakes, cliff walks, and even a floral bazaar. Plus, there was an aviary, a bear pit, and a skeleton of a lost whale that had taken a wrong turn in the Thames. Londoners of the late 19th century could hop on a train or cruise along the Thames by boat, and both options were pretty popular. But on the 3rd of September, 1878, way more people than usual opted for the boat. They chose it over the railroad after a passenger train had collided with goods wagons in Kent, taking the lives of 5 people. The river felt like a safer way to go. One of the ships available for the trip was the SS Princess Alice. The paddle steamer was first launched in 1865 on the west coast of Scotland. Its original name was the Bute, and it was used as a ferry for the passengers of the Weems Bay Railway Company. A couple of years later, it was sold and renamed after Queen Victoria's 3rd child. Then, it was sold again and got the nickname the Shah's Boat, as it transported the Shah of Persia up the Thames to Greenwich in 1873. The ship had gone through several alterations in its lifetime. It got new boilers and watertight bulkheads. The Board of Trade had inspected it and marked it safe. In the year of its final voyage, it was officially allowed to carry up to 936 passengers between London and Gravesend in calm water. On the day of the tragedy, Princess Alice was on what was called a moonlight trip downstream from Swan Pier near London Bridge to Sheerness, Kent and back. The trip wasn't expensive, so most of the passengers were from the working class. There was also a musical band aboard to keep the spirits up. The 3rd of September was a bright day, and many families were happy they could catch some final summer sun rays and enjoy fresh sea air. The then owner of the ship, the London Steamboat Company, had several vessels working on the route. The passengers were free to hop on and off different ships. At around 6:30 p.m., after a beautiful day in the open, the SS Princess Alice headed back to Swan Pier. No one kept official lists of passengers, so we'll never know exactly how many people were on board that evening. But they say the steamer was close to its full capacity. As it got darker and cooler, many families decided to stay inside the saloon or in their cabins below. Some stories from the steamer sound like fate. The captain of Princess Alice let his steerer stay at Gravesend and replaced him with one of the passengers. John Ayres was a sailor but had little experience at the Thames or with a vessel like Princess Alice. Alfred Thomas Merriman, a chef from East London, had been offered to work on the steamer at the last moment. He was 30 years old and a father of 4, so he couldn't say no to extra money. At around 7:40 p.m., he was standing on the deck by the saloon door. By that time, Princess Alice had passed Tripcock Point and entered Galleon's Reach. The passengers could see the North Woolwich Pier in the distance. Many of them planned to disembark at that stop. And that's when Merriman noticed a huge ship carrying coal. It was Bywell Castle. This vessel normally carried coal to Africa, but it had just been repainted at a dry dock. Bywell Castle was going to Newcastle to pick up some coal and transport it to Alexandria, Egypt. The ship's captain, Harrison, wasn't too familiar with these waters, so he called in Christopher Dix, a seasoned Thames River pilot, to lend a hand, even though he didn't have to. The ship had a fancy raised forward part below the deck, and Dix couldn't quite see what was in front of him. So, they had a sailor on lookout duty. As they set sail from Millwall at the speed of 5 knots, 5.7 miles per hour, they tried to stick to the middle of the river, but other boats had other plans. When they were approaching Galleon's Reach, Dick spotted Princess Alice's red port light, headed their way, but planning to pass on the right side. At the same time, Grinstead, the captain of Princess Alice, was going against the river's flow, trying to find the smooth waters on the south side. He adjusted his course, steering into Bywell Castle's path. Both crews realized they were headed for a collision. Dix tried to steer clear and even ordered reverse full speed on the engines, but it was too late. The Bywell Castle collided head-on with the Princess Alice, which was much smaller, weighing less than a third of the 890-ton coal-carrying collier. It sliced the passenger steamer in two. As Merriman remembered later, laughter on board immediately changed into screaming and panic. Some people rushed to the bridge for safety. Merriman hurried to the captain, asking what to do next. The captain's response was grim. "We are sinking fast. Do your best." The ends of the steamer went high into the air, and the middle just sank, taking passengers with it. Those unfortunate ones who were below deck were tragically trapped. The impact caused tons of untreated sewage to gush from outlets near the collision site. The water became a frothy mess of unprocessed waste with a horrible odor. It was potent enough to make even the most resilient sailors retch. Amid the chaos, passengers struggled for life in the contaminated water. They inhaled lungfuls of hazardous waste without knowing. The crew aboard the Bywell Castle sprang into action. They dropped ropes from their deck, urging Princess Alice's passengers to climb aboard. Anything that could float, from planks to barrels, was tossed into the water to serve as flotation devices for those in need. Other members of their team launched a lifeboat, saving 14 people. Nearby boats, moored along the riverbanks, joined the mission, plucking survivors from the water. Many of Princess Alice's passengers didn't know how to swim, and it was even trickier for ladies wearing long, heavy dresses. Merriman was among the lucky ones who could swim. He first held on to a piece of wreckage, and then, when others got to it, swam away and caught onto a rope hanging over the side of the Bywell Castle. They managed to save around 130 people this way. Another survivor was Robert Haynes, who played in the Princess Alice band. He was fond of ships and had noticed the Bywell Castle a couple of minutes before the collision. He chose not to follow the rest of the band, who went downstairs for a break, and that saved his life. Princess Alice's sister ship, Duke of Teck, arrived 10 minutes too late to assist with the rescue efforts. Only 2 people who had been below deck or in the saloon managed to survive the collision. We still don't know the total count of lives taken on that day, but it's somewhere between 650 and 700. And what makes this story even more tragic is that it has been mostly forgotten.
Bet you never heard this story about the Titanic. So, this massive luxury ocean liner was heading out of Southampton on its first voyage to New York with over 2,000 passengers and crew on board. I'll spare you the details for now. You know how it all went down. Since there were a lot of things that went wrong during its short lifespan, some couldn't help but wonder, was it really bad luck? Or was there some mysterious force behind the ruckus? Well, for starters, right as it was leaving the harbor, the Titanic nearly crashed into another ship, called the SS New York. How did that happen? Well, 6 tugboats had to pull the massive Titanic into the river to begin its journey. Captain Smith was in charge, but let's be honest, he probably needed a few more cups of coffee before making any big decisions. So, as the Titanic was speeding along, minding her own business, she passed the New York and the Oceanic ships. The Titanic decided to make a left turn, but the suction was just too much for the poor New York. She started to drift off towards the Titanic. The Oceanic was leaning so much, her gangplank smacked into the water like a belly flop in the pool. Thankfully, the captain of one of the tugboats was there to save the day. He used his trusty megaphone to call the Vulcan to the port side of the Titanic to pick up some crew members. He then noticed the New York in trouble and acted quickly, throwing a line to slow her down. The Titanic's captain was probably scratching his head, wondering how to handle these big ships like the Titanic. That's because he'd only recently experienced sailing on larger ships. Close one, right? Well, it was just part of the story. As it turns out, the huge list of misfortunes might have started even earlier. Another theory suggests that during the ship's construction days in Northern Ireland, a fire broke out in the coal bunkers. Talk about a rocky start. If this information is correct, then the ship's hull may have been affected by the incident before it even set sail. Fans of this theory argue that a fire popped up inside one of the Titanic's large coal bunkers and really damaged an important segment of the ship's hull. Some claim there's even photographic evidence to back this up. A bunch of photos documenting how the ship was made and pampered for its maiden voyage were found, and they showed a significant black streak on the outside of the Titanic's hull. Weirdly enough, the streak was really close to where the iceberg hit during that cold April. Now I know what you're thinking. This theory might sound far-fetched, but most of these people have been gathering information about the Titanic for decades, and they're convinced that this is the real deal. They even believe that the fire started way earlier than the day the Titanic set out on its maiden voyage, particularly about 3 weeks prior. Why was this overlooked? Well, because of fear of bad press, mostly. Also, because of all the fuss created around the unsinkable ship, it was important that they stuck to the initial calendar. Of course, not everyone is convinced by this new theory. Some people think it's just another wacky idea to add to the long list of Titanic sensational theories. What if I told you there were even rumors about part of an ancient Egyptian coffin being on board? Could that have had something to do with the disastrous ending of the Titanic? Some truly believe it did. Let me tell you the story about the unlucky mummy. It's a tale that'll give you goosebumps. Back in the 19th century, this ancient Egyptian artifact, a mummy case lid to be exact, was brought over to Europe. And as soon as it arrived, strange things started happening. Now, some of the stories may be a bit exaggerated, but according to journalists, some of them were actually true. The rumors sparked the interest of a British writer who later spent months investigating the mummy case and its alleged related stories. He was planning to write an article debunking the myths, but he found out they were all too real. Unfortunately, he never got to finish his work because he passed away suddenly. Others believed that the mummy case was guarded by Egyptian elementals. They warned others not to mess with the artifact. The mummy case's history is just as spooky. It was found in Egypt and sold to a certain someone conveniently named Mr. W at a party organized by a well-known English lady. When the mummy case arrived in England, it was given to Mr. W's sister, who immediately suffered from financial losses and other troubles. A photographer who took a picture of the case claimed that he captured a living woman's face on the film. The mummy case eventually ended up in the British Museum, and it's still there today. However, rumors say that it was aboard the Titanic and was responsible for its sinking. But don't believe everything you hear. Some sources claim the mummy case never left the British Museum, and the rumor was started by a journalist named William Stead. He was actually a passenger on the Titanic, and he supposedly told his fellow passengers about the ill-fated mummy before the ship went down. Is that what happens when you tempt fate? Seriously doubt it, but it does make you wonder, doesn't it? It gets even weirder, trust me. About 50 passengers got cold feet before the ship took off, and they refused to board the Titanic at the last minute, even if it meant that they'd lose the cost of the ticket. They just had an extremely bad feeling about the whole deal, and even an Irish astrologer warned against making the voyage on the Titanic. I doubt he saw a big ol' iceberg hidden somewhere in the stars, but it does add up to the mystique surrounding the Titanic. And do you know what's even worse? The fact that the ship's binoculars, which could have helped prevent the iceberg collision, were locked up. Apparently, those binoculars could have been used by lookouts on that fateful night. But guess what? The key was held by David Blair, an officer who was sadly bumped from the crew before the ship's departure. Poor guy. He probably didn't even know what he was holding on to. Now, some historians think that if those binoculars were in use, the iceberg might have been spotted earlier. But hey, let's not point fingers here. Others argue that it wouldn't have made a difference. Who knows? Maybe the lookout was too busy looking at the stars to notice a giant iceberg in front of them. But seriously, what were they thinking? Locking up the binoculars on a ship that big is like forgetting to pack sunscreen for a trip to the beach. Also, the ship might have been going a bit too fast. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why was the captain in such a hurry? Well, apparently, good old Captain Smith was trying to beat his ship's older sibling, the Olympic, in a race to see which ship could cross the Atlantic faster. I guess he had a bit of a sibling rivalry going on or something. But here's the thing. Even though there were warnings about icebergs in the area, the Titanic just kept on chugging along at full speed ahead. I mean, come on, guys, it's not rocket science. If you know there are icebergs around, maybe slow down a little bit, right? And then, close to midnight on April 14th, 1912, the Titanic hit that iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic. It also famously had a mere 16 lifeboats and 4 collapsible dinghies on board. No wonder it ended up being one of the worst maritime disasters in modern history. After the whole event, people started believing in life beyond the veil and contacted mediums, hoping for signs from the ones they had lost at sea. Can't say I blame them, though there's no verified story of someone managing to contact